Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm glad you're here tonight. Find somewhere comfortable. Let the room become quiet. You might be listening from a bed, a couch, a late night shift, or a house where everyone else has already gone to sleep. Wherever you are, take a moment and think about the place you call home. When people hear the word home, they usually picture something private, a front door, a familiar hallway, the sound of someone moving in the next room, a kitchen cabinet that never closes properly, maybe a neighbour whose footsteps you recognise through the ceiling. Home is rarely perfect, but it is known. It is the place where ordinary life keeps happening, even when the rest of the world is not paying attention. Tonight, we are going to a place the rest of the world paid attention to for all the wrong reasons. Not a battlefield, although gunfire would eventually become familiar there. Not a prison, although newspapers and television reports often described it as though its residents were trapped inside one. Not a ruined city abandoned after a war, although some photographs made it appear that way. We're going to Chicago's near north side, to a group of brick apartment buildings that became known across the United States as Cabrini-Green. Before we go any further, tell me something. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you in a city apartment with traffic outside? A quiet suburban house? Somewhere rural, where the nearest neighbour is a long walk away? You do not have to write a long answer. A city, a country, or even just the time where you are is enough. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. If this kind of slow, detailed history helps you settle in, you can subscribe and leave a like. There is no need to interrupt your evening to do it. Wait until the story gives you a reason. Now let us begin with an image that is probably already in your mind. You may picture a row of enormous high-rise buildings standing against the Chicago sky. Their outer walkways are covered with steel fencing. Windows are broken or boarded. Graffiti runs across concrete walls. Police cars wait near the entrances. Somewhere above, people look down from balconies and open galleries. Somewhere below, a television reporter stands in front of a camera and tells the country that this is one of the most dangerous places in America. That image existed. It was photographed, filmed and repeated for years. But it was not the beginning. Long before Cabrini-Green became a national symbol of crime, gangs and failed public housing, it was presented as a solution. Its first apartments were clean, modern and highly desirable, compared with the housing they replaced. Families applied to live there. Children played in courtyards that planners believed would create healthy community life. Residents organised clubs, watched one another's children, attended nearby churches and built relationships that lasted for decades. To understand how the same place could represent hope in one generation and disaster in another, we have to set aside the version created by headlines. We have to walk into the buildings before the elevators broke, before the lights went dark, before vacant apartments were left unsecured, and before many Americans knew the name Cabrini-Green at all. The story begins in a Chicago neighbourhood that already carried a difficult reputation. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, the area west of Chicago's wealthy near-north districts was occupied largely by working-class immigrants. Irish families lived there. Swedish families arrived in large numbers, giving part of the neighbourhood the name Swede Town. Italian immigrants followed, many of them from Sicily. Factories, rail yards, warehouses and industrial buildings provided employment, while small houses, tenements and crowded wooden structures filled the streets nearby. One section became known as Little Hell. The name was not invented by a modern documentary producer. It was used while people were living there, and it reflected both the physical conditions and the way outsiders viewed the neighbourhood. Smoke from industry hung over the area. Homes were overcrowded. Streets could become muddy and dirty. Fires were common in cheaply constructed buildings. Poverty was visible, and crime gave the district a reputation that reached beyond its boundaries. Yet Little Hell was not simply a collection of collapsing houses occupied by strangers. It was a neighbourhood. People ran grocery stores, bakeries and taverns. Families attended churches. Children formed friendships in alleys and schoolyards. Adults found work through relatives and neighbours. The same closeness that allowed conflict and criminal activity to spread also allowed residents to support one another. This distinction matters because city officials often spoke about poor neighbourhoods as if nothing valuable existed inside them. A planner could look at an old block and see overcrowding, damaged buildings and disease statistics. A resident could look at the same block and see a grandmother 2 doors away, a grocer who extended credit, and a church that had held every family wedding and funeral for 20 years. Both descriptions might be true. The problem was that only one of them usually appeared on the official map. By the 1930s, the United States was in the Great Depression. Housing conditions in many American cities had become impossible to ignore. Reformers argued that private landlords had failed to provide safe homes for poor families. Buildings lacked reliable plumbing, heating and ventilation. Children became sick in damp rooms. Fires moved quickly through crowded structures. Families paid rent for apartments that officials themselves described as unfit for human habitation. The federal government began supporting large-scale public housing, and the Chicago Housing Authority was established in 1937. Its purpose sounded straightforward: replace dangerous housing with decent, affordable homes for low-income residents. That promise was significant. A public apartment was not originally imagined as a last stop for the permanently poor. Early public housing was often intended for working families whose incomes were too low for the private market, but who were expected to follow strict rules, pay rent and maintain their homes. Applicants could be screened. Managers inspected housekeeping. Families might be rejected because of irregular employment, unpaid bills, or behaviour considered unsuitable. This system could be intrusive and unfair, but it also meant that early developments often housed residents with stable employment and enough income to support local businesses and institutions. In 1942, during the Second World War, the first part of what would later become Cabrini-Green opened. It was called the Francis Cabrini Homes, named for Mother Frances Xavier Cabrini, an Italian-born Catholic missionary who had worked among immigrants in Chicago and had become the first American citizen canonized as a saint. These were not the towers most people remember. The original Cabrini homes consisted of low-rise brick buildings, generally 2 or 3 stories high, arranged around open spaces. There were 586 apartments. Compared with the housing of Little Hell, they offered improvements that were impossible to miss: indoor bathrooms, hot and cold running water, central heating, and rooms designed to receive light and air. Imagine moving into one of those apartments in the early 1940s. You've spent years in a building where several families may share a toilet. The walls are thin. Winter air enters through gaps around the windows. Water must be heated manually. Rats are a normal part of the night. Then you are handed keys to an apartment with reliable plumbing, clean walls and enough windows for daylight to reach the rooms. You would not call it a housing project with the tone people later used. You might call it the nicest home your family had ever known. The population was initially mixed. Italian, Irish and other white residents lived alongside black families, many of whom had come to Chicago during the Great Migration, or had arrived more recently in search of industrial employment. Puerto Rican residents also became part of the community. War workers and veterans moved in. The development stood close to factories and commercial areas, and it was not far from some of the wealthiest streets in Chicago. That location would shape everything that followed. Cabrini was built near the centre of opportunity, but also beside a sharp racial and economic boundary. To the east stood the Gold Coast, with expensive apartments, hotels and shops. To the west were working-class and industrial neighbourhoods. A person could travel a short distance and move between entirely different versions of Chicago. This was not unusual for the city. Chicago had long been divided by ethnicity, class and race, but the boundaries were maintained by more than personal preference. real estate agreements, lending practices, discriminatory landlords, and organised neighbourhood resistance restricted where black families could live. Banks denied mortgages in areas marked as risky, often because black residents lived there or might move there. White property owners signed restrictive covenants promising not to sell or rent to black households. Violence and intimidation were sometimes used when black families crossed established boundaries. The result was not merely separation, it was overcrowding. Chicago's black population grew rapidly as families left the South, seeking industrial jobs and relief from Jim Crow laws. Yet the territory in which they were permitted to find housing did not expand at the same rate. More people were forced into the same limited number of blocks. Landlords divided apartments into smaller units. Rents rose. Buildings wore out under heavy use. A housing shortage created by discrimination was then presented as evidence that black neighbourhoods were naturally overcrowded and unstable. Public housing might have reduced that pressure if it had been spread throughout the city. Instead, political resistance shaped where new projects could be built. White aldermen opposed public housing in their wards. Residents feared racial integration, declining property values, or simply the arrival of poor families. Sites in white neighbourhoods were rejected while large developments were approved in or near existing black communities. The Chicago Housing Authority's family projects increasingly reinforced the city's racial geography rather than breaking it apart. After the mid-1950s, much of Chicago's public housing was constructed in high-rise superblocks located in or along the edges of black neighbourhoods. Cabrini appeared, at first, to be an exception because of its near-north location and its earlier mixture of residents. That difference would not last. The original low-rise homes were expanded in 1958 with the completion of the Cabrini extension. 15 buildings added 1,925 apartments. Many were high-rises, tall brick structures with exterior galleries running along their sides. In 1962, the William Green homes added another 1,096 apartments. Together, the three sections contained 3,607 units and became known collectively as Cabrini-Green. From a distance, the scale was impressive. Modern planners believed high-rise construction would allow large numbers of families to live on limited urban land while preserving open space around the buildings. Instead of narrow streets crowded with deteriorating houses, there would be lawns, playgrounds, and broad views. Apartments above ground level would receive sunlight and ventilation. Cars and through traffic could be separated from areas where children played. These ideas were not ridiculous. Similar principles appeared in modern architecture around the world. Under the right conditions, with adequate staffing, regular repairs, functioning elevators, active ground floor spaces, and a stable mix of residents, tall apartment buildings could work. The trouble was that Cabrini-Green would not receive the right conditions. Consider what a high-rise requires. A 2-story house can remain usable when a light bulb in the hallway burns out. A 16-story building cannot function safely when elevators repeatedly fail. A small apartment block may survive delayed repairs. A complex containing thousands of children, hundreds of common areas, miles of plumbing and countless doors, windows and fixtures needs constant maintenance. The exterior galleries created another problem. They were essentially open-air corridors giving access to apartments across the length of each floor. Planners intended them as social spaces where neighbours could meet and children could play under adult supervision. When buildings were well managed and fully occupied, the galleries could serve that purpose. When lights failed, elevators broke, and vacant units were not secured, the same galleries became difficult to monitor. One person could see across an enormous section of a building. Someone controlling a stairwell or elevator landing could observe who entered and left. The architecture did not create gangs or violence, but neglect allowed particular features of the architecture to be used in ways the designers had not intended. The elevators deserve special attention because they shaped everyday life inside the towers. For a resident on the 15th floor, an elevator was not a convenience. It was the street connecting the apartment to the city. Groceries had to travel through it. Strollers, school children, furniture, elderly residents and emergency workers all depended on it. When an elevator stopped, the building did not merely become inconvenient. The upper floors became isolated. A mother returning with several bags of groceries might face a climb of 10 or 15 stories. A child leaving for school had to begin the day on a dark stairway. An older resident might remain inside rather than risk the journey. Firefighters and paramedics lost valuable time. People trapped in the elevator could wait while maintenance crews handled a backlog of repairs across the housing system. When the elevators were operating, however, they carried thousands of ordinary conversations. People greeted one another on the way to work. Children crowded inside in the morning. Residents balanced laundry baskets and grocery bags. Someone complained about the weather. Someone asked about a sick relative. Teenagers pushed every button. Neighbours held the door for an elderly woman moving slowly down the gallery. This is the Cabrini-Green that disappeared from most national coverage. Not a quiet or ideal place, but a functioning residential community filled with recognizable human routines. There were rent parties and birthday celebrations. People borrowed food from neighbours. Children attended local schools and played in the open spaces between buildings. Churches became important centres of support. Residents formed councils and organisations. Adults tried to keep hallways clean, supervise young people and pressure the housing authority to make repairs. Many families remained for years, not because they lacked ambition, but because Cabrini was home, and because discrimination continued to limit where black Chicagoans could move. The same barriers that had produced overcrowding before public housing continued outside its walls. Affordable apartments in other neighbourhoods were difficult to obtain. Mortgages remained inaccessible to many families. Leaving the project required opportunities that were not equally available. During the 1950s and 1960s, the racial composition changed. White residents gained greater access to suburban housing and government-supported mortgages. Black families remained constrained by segregation in the private market. By the early 1960s, Cabrini-Green had become overwhelmingly African American. This shift was sometimes described as though residents had voluntarily separated themselves. In reality, public policy had helped create the separation. The federal government subsidized suburban home ownership for millions of white families, while discriminatory practices excluded many black households from the same opportunity. At the same time, public housing was increasingly concentrated in neighborhoods where black residents were already permitted to live. One population was being helped to build equity through home ownership. Another was being concentrated in rental developments controlled by agencies that would soon struggle to maintain them. That difference accumulated over time. A family purchasing a modest suburban house could gain wealth as property values increased. The house might later help pay for college, support a business or provide an inheritance. A family in public housing could gain stability and shelter, which were valuable, but rent payments did not create ownership. If maintenance declined, residents had little control over the physical conditions. If political leaders reduced funding, the consequences appeared in their hallways and apartments. By the late 1960s, the warning signs were becoming clearer. The Chicago Housing Authority faced financial pressure. The system depended heavily on rent collected from tenants. But federal rules and the increasing concentration of very poor households limited that revenue. Maintenance needs grew as buildings aged. Experienced managers left. Repair requests accumulated. Vacant apartments were sometimes left open. Broken fixtures remained broken long enough to become normal. The city around Cabrini-Green was also changing. Industrial jobs that had supported working-class families began disappearing or moving away. Factories closed, employers relocated. Jobs that remained were not always accessible to residents facing discrimination, limited transportation, or inadequate schooling. Families who gained enough income to leave public housing often did so, while those with fewer options remained. This produced a concentration of poverty that the earliest developments had not been designed to handle. Think about what happens to a neighbourhood when several pressures arrive at once. The buildings need more repairs, but the maintenance budget is shrinking. Families need employment, but nearby jobs are disappearing. Young people need stable institutions, but schools and recreation programs are under strain. Residents who can leave often choose to go, taking income and political influence with them. Those who remain are blamed for conditions they did not create. None of this happens in a single dramatic moment. There is no morning when everyone wakes and discovers that a community has failed. The process appears one small breakdown at a time. A hallway light goes out and is not replaced. An elevator stops working for several days. A playground fixture breaks. A family moves away, and the empty apartment is not immediately secured. A stairwell becomes a place children are warned to avoid. Police respond slowly because the address has developed a reputation. A newspaper reports a crime, but says little about the people organising a tenants' meeting the same week. Eventually, the reputation begins influencing the reality. Employers hear the address and make assumptions. Taxi drivers refuse to enter. Delivery services avoid the buildings. Residents become reluctant to invite outsiders home. Politicians use the development as an example of disorder while providing little money to correct the conditions that produced it. Cabrini-Green became notorious partly because of where it stood. Unlike many large Chicago housing projects built farther south or west, Cabrini was close to downtown, wealthy neighborhoods and valuable real estate. Poverty was visible from places where powerful people lived and worked. The towers could not be treated as a distant problem. They stood near the Gold Coast and not far from the expanding commercial districts of the near North Side. By the late 20th century, increasingly expensive land surrounded a community whose residents were among the city's poorest. That proximity created fascination. Journalists could reach Cabrini quickly. Television crews could film the buildings and return downtown before the evening broadcast. Politicians could visit for a press conference. Police operations could become public spectacles. The development became a symbol through which Americans discussed crime, race, welfare, policing, and urban decline. Symbols are useful because they simplify difficult subjects. They're also dangerous because real people disappear inside them. A viewer in another state could hear Cabrini-Green and imagine one enormous criminal population. The residents knew something more complicated. One building could feel entirely different from the building beside it. One floor might be controlled by a strong group of residents who watched the hallway and kept trouble away. Another might have vacant units and failing lights. A family could feel secure during the afternoon and unsafe after dark. A child could fear the stairwell but feel protected inside a neighbour's apartment. There were residents involved in gangs and drug markets. There were also teachers, nurses, factory workers, veterans, church members, political organisers, grandparents and children trying to complete homework at kitchen tables. The existence of one group did not erase the other. That is why we cannot begin this story with the first gunshot, the first drug sale, or the first police raid. Beginning there would repeat the mistake made by decades of coverage. It would present violence as the natural starting condition of Cabrini-Green rather than something that developed through a combination of policy choices, economic change, segregation, institutional neglect and individual decisions. For tonight, hold on to a simpler scene. It is an evening in Cabrini-Green before the name has become shorthand for disaster. The sun is setting over Chicago. Light reflects from windows across the near North Side. Inside one of the high-rises, an elevator is moving from floor to floor. It stops for a man returning from work. It opens again for two children carrying school books. A woman steps inside with a grocery bag held against her hip. Someone has written on the wall, but the light above the door is still working. Outside, children are being called home. Dinner is cooking in hundreds of apartments. Radios carry music through open windows. Televisions are turned on. neighbours talk across the gallery. Somewhere below, a group of residents is discussing repairs that need to be made. Somewhere above, a mother tells her children not to play near the stairwell. The buildings are already showing weaknesses, but they are not ruins. The community is already under pressure, but it is not without order. The residents do not know that their home will one day be shown repeatedly on national television. They do not know that politicians will stand outside and promise to reclaim the neighbourhood. They do not know that the name Cabrini-Green will become attached to nearly every American fear about public housing. They are simply living there. And before we can understand how that ordinary evening changed, we need to understand why Chicago built these apartments in the first place, why so many families needed them, and why a housing system created to eliminate slums began reproducing the same inequality it was supposed to remove. The answer begins with the fact that city officials understood long before Cabrini-Green became famous. Chicago had a serious housing problem, and the private market was not going to solve it for everyone. By the 1930s, large parts of the city contained homes that were overcrowded, poorly heated, and dangerously maintained. Some apartments had no private bathroom. Several families might share one toilet in a hallway or an outdoor structure. Water leaked through roofs. Rats moved through walls and basements. Coal smoke from factories and household furnaces settled over working-class districts. Fires spread quickly through wooden buildings divided into smaller and smaller rooms by landlords trying to collect more rent from the same amount of space. These conditions were not limited to one racial or ethnic group. Chicago's industrial economy had attracted Irish, German, Swedish, Polish, Italian, Jewish and other immigrant communities for generations. Each new population often entered the city through districts where housing was cheap and employment was nearby. Families lived close to factories, slaughterhouses, warehouses and railroad lines because transportation was limited and workdays were long. A worker who began before sunrise could not afford a complicated journey across the city. The neighbourhood that would later contain Cabrini-Green followed this pattern. It began as an immigrant district close to industrial employment and the commercial centre of Chicago. By the early 20th century, parts of it were known for severe poverty and physical deterioration. Reformers toured its streets, recorded its conditions and argued that the buildings should be cleared. There was genuine concern behind that argument. Children were becoming sick in damp rooms. Families were being injured or killed in fires. Landlords collected rent while delaying repairs. Some homes were so crowded that beds were used in shifts. A person returning from night work might sleep in the same place another person had just left for a daytime job. The reformers were not imagining the problem. What they often failed to understand was that demolishing a neighbourhood did not automatically solve the conditions that had produced it. A family still needed an affordable place to live. A worker still needed access to employment. Children still needed schools, shops, and familiar adults nearby. Removing a building was much easier than replacing the network of daily life inside it. During the Great Depression, the scale of the crisis forced the federal government to become involved. Unemployment had reduced the ability of families to pay rent. Construction had slowed, and private investment had collapsed. Housing reform became part of the broader attempt to use public action against economic failure. The Chicago Housing Authority was established in 1937. Its early leaders believed that government could build safe, sanitary homes for families whom private landlords had neglected. The goal was not originally to create permanent communities of extreme poverty. Public housing was supposed to provide decent accommodation for working people whose incomes were modest but stable. The distinction is important. The earliest public housing authorities did not simply open their doors to anyone who needed shelter. Applicants were investigated. Managers examined employment, income, household composition, rent history, and personal conduct. Families could be rejected if officials believed they would not maintain an apartment properly. Once admitted, tenants faced inspections and rules governing everything from housekeeping to the behaviour of their children. Some of these practices were paternalistic. Officials often treated poor adults as though they required supervision rather than housing. A manager might decide whether a family was respectable enough to deserve an apartment. Women raising children without husbands could be viewed with suspicion. Tenants had less privacy than people renting from ordinary landlords. Yet the screening process also produced developments with many regularly employed adults. Rent payments provided revenue. Residents had the income to support nearby stores. Working parents expected building management to enforce rules and make repairs. Public housing could function as a stable working-class community when those conditions remained in place. Elizabeth Wood, one of the most influential early leaders of the Chicago Housing Authority, believed public housing should be carefully managed and distributed throughout the city. She did not want it confined to the poorest districts. Her approach assumed that low-income families should have access to healthy neighborhoods and that developments should not become isolated from the larger urban economy. That idea immediately collided with Chicago politics. A public housing development required land. Land lay inside an alderman's ward. Aldermen listened to homeowners, real estate interests, neighborhood organizations and political allies who often opposed the arrival of public housing. In many white communities, the opposition was tied directly to race. Residents feared that a development would bring black families into their neighborhood. Property owners had been told for years that racial integration would destroy home values. Banks, brokers and government agencies had reinforced that belief through lending and appraisal systems that treated black occupancy as a financial risk. Restrictive covenants prevented many owners from selling homes to black buyers. Real estate organizations disciplined brokers who crossed racial boundaries. Violence sometimes followed when a black family moved onto a previously white block. Public housing did not exist outside this system. If the housing authority proposed a site in a white neighborhood, local resistance could be intense. Meetings filled with angry residents. Politicians blocked approval. Officials warned of disorder, falling property values or overcrowded schools. The language sometimes avoided direct racial statements, but the meaning was usually clear. In 1946, Elizabeth Wood proposed building public housing in less congested areas to relieve the extreme overcrowding faced by black Chicagoans. White opposition, including violent resistance, helped prevent that policy from taking hold. Political pressure eventually forced the housing authority to preserve existing racial boundaries rather than challenge them. This decision shaped Chicago for decades. The city's black population had grown rapidly during the Great Migration. Families came from Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, Alabama, and other parts of the South. They were leaving segregation, racial violence, restricted voting rights, and agricultural work that offered little chance of advancement. Chicago promised industrial wages, public schools, and a greater measure of legal freedom. The promise was real, but it was limited. A black worker might earn a wage in a steel mill, packing plant, or factory, and still find that most of the city's housing market was closed to his family. The areas where black residents were permitted to rent became more crowded as the population increased. Landlords divided apartments and charged high prices because tenants had few alternatives. Buildings deteriorated under heavy use, and the shortage of housing made it difficult for families to demand repairs. City officials then pointed to the overcrowding as a reason for clearing black neighborhoods. The same government that tolerated or supported residential segregation presented demolition as a rescue. This contradiction was built into post-war urban renewal. Officials described old neighborhoods as slums and promised modern replacement housing. Highways, institutional expansion, and redevelopment projects displaced thousands of families. Yet new public housing was often placed in or near the same segregated areas from which black residents were being removed. Instead of opening the city, the housing program frequently rebuilt segregation in concrete and brick. The first Francis Cabrini homes, opened during the Second World War, did not yet represent the full scale of that policy. The low-rise development contained 586 apartments and housed a mixture of residents, including war workers, veterans, Italian Americans, Irish Americans, Puerto Ricans, and African Americans. It replaced part of the district known as Little Hell and provided plumbing, heating, and sanitary conditions that many nearby homes lacked. For families entering those apartments, the reform worked. The buildings were new, management was present, the grounds were maintained. Residents paid rent and followed rules. Children had open space outside. The development stood close to jobs and transportation. It was possible to believe that public housing had delivered exactly what reformers promised. Chicago's housing needs continued to grow after the war. Veterans returned. Families formed. The city faced pressure to replace more deteriorated housing and accommodate people displaced by construction. Federal policy encouraged large projects, and modern architects promoted high-rise buildings surrounded by open land. The high-rise model appeared efficient. A tall building could place hundreds of apartments on a relatively small site. Elevators would replace long walks upstairs. Apartments above street level would receive light and air. Removing the old street grid would allow planners to create broad lawns and playgrounds between buildings. Families would be separated from traffic, noise, and crowded commercial blocks. The design looked orderly when seen from above. This was how planners often viewed cities, from maps, models, and architectural drawings. On paper, the older neighbourhood appeared chaotic. Streets cut through every block. Shops, homes, workshops, and alleys were mixed together. Buildings varied in age and size. People moved through narrow public spaces that were difficult to control. The superblock offered the opposite. Several old city blocks could be combined into one large site. Streets would be removed. Buildings would stand apart from one another. Open space would replace the density of the traditional neighbourhood. That open space was supposed to improve life. It also removed the constant activity that had made older streets easier to observe. A shopkeeper no longer watched the sidewalk from behind a counter. Residents no longer looked down on a small street where they recognised nearly everyone passing. The spaces between towers belonged to everyone in theory, which often meant that no individual felt responsible for them. The problem was not simply that high-rise buildings were tall. Chicago contained many successful high-rise apartments. Wealthy residents lived in towers with doormen, maintenance workers, secure entrances, and reliable elevators. Middle-class buildings employed staff and collected enough rent to repair mechanical systems. Public housing towers were expected to operate under completely different financial conditions. They contained large numbers of children and families whose rents were kept low. Hallways, elevators, stairwells, playgrounds, and plumbing systems received intense daily use. The buildings required more maintenance, not less. Yet the materials were often selected according to a no-frills philosophy, and budgets did not provide the level of staffing necessary to keep large developments in good condition over many years. The Cabrini extension opened in 1958 with 1,925 apartments in 15 buildings. The William Green homes followed in 1962 with 1,096 more. Combined with the original low-rise homes, Cabrini-Green contained 3,607 units. The expansion changed the nature of the community. A low-rise development of several hundred apartments could still resemble a residential neighbourhood. The new high-rises created a population comparable to that of a small town, compressed into a limited area and managed by one public agency. Thousands of people depended on the same maintenance system. A broken boiler affected many families. An elevator failure isolated entire sections of a building. A shortage of janitors allowed trash to accumulate quickly. A damaged entrance door could expose hundreds of residents to anyone entering from outside. The design also placed much of daily life in spaces that were neither fully public nor private. The exterior galleries were open corridors running along the buildings. Residents crossed them to reach their apartments. Children played on them. Adults spoke across them. From one point, a person could observe a large part of the building. When the galleries were clean, lit and supervised, they could support community life. Neighbours saw who approached an apartment. Parents watched children from their doorways. Air moved through the open corridors during hot weather. When maintenance declined, the same galleries became dangerous. Broken lights created long, dark sections. Damaged railings placed children at risk. Unsecured stairwells allowed people to move through buildings without passing a controlled entrance. Vacant apartments could be occupied or used for illegal activity. Steel fencing was later installed along galleries and balconies to prevent objects and people from falling, giving the buildings the caged appearance that became familiar in photographs. None of that was visible in the clean architectural drawings. The planners had assumed that physical design could produce social order. They had not planned for decades of shrinking budgets, political neglect and concentrated unemployment. They had not created enough protected indoor space for young people. They had not provided the dense mixture of shops, offices and services that kept ordinary streets active throughout the day. They had built housing without building a complete neighbourhood. The racial transformation of Cabrini-Green occurred alongside these physical changes. White residents gained access to suburban homes through mortgage systems and new construction that were often unavailable to black families. As white households left public housing, black applicants filled vacancies. By the early 1960s, Cabrini-Green had become overwhelmingly African American. This was not the result of a natural preference for separation. It reflected decisions made by lenders, real estate agents, government agencies, homeowners and politicians. Black families were concentrated in public housing because the private housing market restricted their choices. Public housing was concentrated in black neighbourhoods because white political leaders resisted its construction elsewhere. The pattern became so obvious that it eventually produced a major federal lawsuit. In 1966, Dorothy Gautreaux and other black tenants and applicants sued the Chicago Housing Authority. They argued that the agency had deliberately selected sites and assigned tenants in ways that maintained racial segregation. The evidence showed that family public housing built after 1950 had been placed almost entirely in or near black neighbourhoods. In 1969, a federal court found that the Housing Authority had violated the constitutional rights of black residents through its site selection and tenant assignment policies. The case continued for years and eventually reached the United States Supreme Court. The courts accepted that the remedy could extend beyond Chicago itself because the segregated housing system had been supported by both local and federal action. By the time the legal system formally recognized the damage, the physical pattern was already established. Large developments stood where political leaders had allowed them to stand. Families had been assigned to them. Schools, transportation routes, and employment opportunities had developed around a divided city. A court could order future changes, but it could not quickly undo decades of housing policy. Cabrini-Green occupied a particularly unusual position within that divided landscape. It was close to downtown and the wealthy Gold Coast. Residents could see expensive buildings from their windows. Major commercial districts were nearby. The project was not isolated at the far edge of the city. Yet social distance did not disappear simply because physical distance was small. A child could grow up within sight of wealth while attending an underfunded school. A parent could live near thousands of jobs and still face discrimination in hiring. A family could occupy land that was becoming more valuable while having no ownership stake in it. This proximity would later make Cabrini-Green attractive to developers and politically difficult to ignore. During its early years, however, it allowed officials to present the project as evidence that Chicago had placed low-income housing near opportunity. The reality was less generous. Residents needed more than geographic closeness. They needed safe routes, good schools, stable employment, reliable building services, and freedom from racial discrimination. Housing could not compensate for the absence of all those things at once. The financial structure of public housing made matters worse. Federal funds paid much of the cost of construction, but local housing authorities were expected to operate developments largely through rent. As the tenant population became poorer, rent revenue declined. At the same time, buildings grew older and required more expensive repairs. This created a simple but destructive equation. The residents with the greatest needs produced the least revenue, while the properties requiring the most maintenance received the fewest resources. In 1969, federal legislation limited the rent charge to public housing tenants to a percentage of household income. The rule protected poor families from unaffordable rent, but Congress did not initially provide enough operating subsidies to replace the revenue housing authorities lost. Agencies across the country struggled, and Chicago's already serious maintenance problems deepened. The original model had assumed a tenant population containing many wage earners. That assumption no longer matched reality. Employment was also changing. Manufacturing had once given Chicago residents access to jobs that did not require advanced education. A person could support a family through work in a factory, warehouse, or industrial plant. Beginning in the post-war decades and accelerating through the 1960s and 1970s, many of those jobs disappeared, moved to suburbs, or left the region. Black workers were especially vulnerable. They had often been the last hired into industrial positions and were among the first affected by layoffs. Suburban jobs were difficult to reach without a car. Housing discrimination prevented many families from moving closer to new employment. Public transportation did not always connect residential areas with expanding job centres. The people living in Cabrini-Green were therefore being separated from the economic structure that had made early public housing workable. Working families who improved their income were encouraged or required to pay higher rents. Some chose to leave for private housing when they could. Their departure removed stable earners from the development. Families with fewer options remained. This process did not mean that Cabrini-Green contained no employed adults. Many residents continued working in hospitals, city departments, factories, restaurants, schools, and private homes. But the overall economic balance changed. The number of households headed by women increased. Many mothers were supporting children with limited wages, public assistance, or both. The proportion of young residents became unusually high. A development containing thousands of children needed strong schools, recreation programs, social services, and safe common spaces. Those institutions were never funded at the level required. City leaders often discussed the resulting conditions as a failure of residents' behaviour. They spoke about dependency, disorder, and broken families. It was easier to describe poverty as a collection of personal choices than to explain how public policy had placed poor families in the same developments, restricted their access to other neighbourhoods, and allowed the buildings around them to deteriorate. Residents noticed the difference between the promises and the reality. They had been told that public housing would provide safe, modern homes. They watched elevators remain broken. They reported leaking pipes and waited. They requested new lights for dark galleries. They complained about trash collection, security, and vacant apartments. Tenant organisations formed because residents understood that the housing authority responded more quickly when pressure was organised. Women often led these efforts. They attended meetings, contacted officials, organised patrols, and confronted managers. They were not passive people waiting for outsiders to rescue them. Their work rarely appeared in national stories. A camera crew preferred a broken window to a meeting about replacing it. Violence produced dramatic footage. Maintenance requests did not. The slow labour required to keep a community functioning attracted little attention until that labour failed. Even during the years of decline, residents created order where official systems had weakened. Adults watched children who were not their own. Neighbours carried groceries for elderly residents when elevators failed. Families shared telephones. Church groups distributed food and organised activities. Residents knew which stairwells were safe, which doors locked, and which adults could be called during an emergency. These informal systems helped people survive. they also concealed the seriousness of institutional failure. As long as residents found ways to work around broken services, the city could delay permanent solutions. A mother climbing 14 floors with grocery bags solved the immediate problem of feeding her children. She also prevented the elevator failure from becoming an emergency visible to anyone outside the building. A tenant replacing a hallway bulb with one purchased from her own money-restored light for the evening. She also performed work the housing authority had been paid to provide. The buildings continued operating because residents absorbed the cost of neglect with their time, labour and safety. By the late 1960s, Cabrini-Green contained the basic elements of the crisis that would later define it. The development was racially isolated, even though it stood near wealthy white neighbourhoods. Its population was becoming poorer as industrial employment declined. Its high-rise design required constant maintenance that the housing authority could not provide. Its children were growing up in buildings with too few supervised spaces. Police relationships with black Chicagoans were marked by distrust and conflict. Political leaders treated public housing as both a social obligation and a burden they preferred not to discuss. The place had been created through good intentions, but good intentions were only one part of its history. The reformers had wanted to eliminate dangerous housing. The politicians had wanted to preserve racial boundaries. The architects had wanted to create order through design. The federal government had wanted to house large numbers of people at limited cost. The housing authority had wanted rents low enough for poor families and high enough to maintain enormous buildings. These goals did not fit together. What emerged was not the plan of any one person. It was the result of compromises, exclusions and decisions that seemed manageable when considered separately. Build the towers here because another ward refuses them. Reduce construction costs because the budget is limited. Leave out commercial streets because open space is healthier. Depend on tenant rent because long-term subsidies are politically unpopular. Concentrate families with the fewest housing choices because other neighbourhoods remain closed. Delay one repair because another building has a more urgent problem. Over time, these decisions became the environment in which thousands of people lived. During the day, Cabrini-Green could still feel busy and familiar. Children crossed the grounds on their way to school. Adults waited for buses. Music came through apartment windows. Residents stopped to talk beside entrances. The neighbourhood contained friendships, arguments, romances, churches, political campaigns and ordinary household routines. After dark, the weaknesses became more visible. A burned-out light mattered more. An elevator delay felt longer. A stairwell without supervision became harder to trust. Groups of young men gathered in places where recreation programs had disappeared. Police entered the development as outsiders, often in response to a specific call and often expecting hostility. The city had not yet reached the worst period of Cabrini-Green's violence. The large drug markets associated with later decades had not fully formed. The buildings had not acquired their final national reputation. Still, the foundation had been laid. A community was being separated from opportunity while surrounded by it. The public agency responsible for the buildings lacked the money and political support to maintain them. Young residents were entering a city where legal employment was becoming less available, and illegal economies were beginning to offer faster rewards. The towers had been built to replace the disorder of the old neighbourhood. They now contained a new kind of vulnerability, one that would become more serious when unemployment deepened. Gangs expanded their control, and a profitable drug trade entered the galleries and stairwells. Crack did not arrive at Cabrini-Green on one particular night. There was no single car pulling up beside the buildings, no stranger opening a suitcase, no moment when the residents looked out of their windows and realised that the economy of the neighbourhood had changed. The transformation happened through conversations, small sales, new customers and experiments conducted in kitchens and vacant apartments. At first, many people would not have recognised it as the beginning of anything larger. It only felt sudden afterward. By the middle of the 1980s, a drug that had been unusual in Chicago became cheap enough to sell in very small quantities. It could be carried in a pocket, divided quickly, and purchased with far less money than powdered cocaine. A person did not need to enter a nightclub, know a wealthy supplier, or collect enough cash for an expensive package. The product could be sold for a few dollars on a sidewalk, in a lobby, or beside an elevator. That change brought a new kind of customer into the street drug market. It also gave gangs and independent dealers a product that could generate money throughout the day and night. The physical amount involved in each sale was tiny, but hundreds of small exchanges could produce a large income. For residents of Cabrini-Green, this new market did not enter an empty space. Street gangs had existed in and around the development for years. Gang violence was already severe before crack became widely available. In the first months of 1981, Cabrini-Green experienced a period of shootings and killings, serious enough to push Mayor Jane Byrne into making her highly publicised temporary move to the development. A federal criminal justice study later described the special police unit created there that year and the aggressive enforcement campaign that followed. Contemporary accounts reported that the gangs involved were already controlling illegal activity, demanding payments from independent dealers, and fighting over influence inside particular buildings. The important difference is that the earlier illegal economy was not organised around crack. Marijuana, heroin, gambling, theft, and other forms of crime already brought money into gang organisations. Dealers operated in the neighbourhood, and residents already knew that certain stairwells, corners, or apartments were connected to illegal business. Control over these activities gave gang leaders influence, but many of the markets were smaller, slower, or dependent on customers with established habits. Crack increased the speed. The drug was made by processing powdered cocaine into small solid pieces that could be smoked. Smoking delivered the effects rapidly, and those effects faded quickly enough to encourage repeated use. For a seller, this meant that the same customer might return several times in one day. A small amount of cocaine could be divided into many individual sales, each producing cash immediately. The price mattered as much as the chemistry. Powdered cocaine had been associated with wealth, nightlife, and professional users who could afford larger purchases. Crack allowed dealers to sell cocaine in inexpensive units. The new form did not make cocaine genuinely cheap in the long term. Addiction could consume every available dollar. What changed was the amount needed to begin. A person could arrive with a small bill and leave with a small rock. This made the market easier to enter from both sides. A buyer did not need much money. A low-level seller did not need to hold a large supply. A teenager could be placed near an entrance with a limited number of packets, collect cash, and report to someone above him. If police appeared, he might carry too little to reveal the size of the larger operation. Cabrini-Green offered conditions that made this style of selling especially effective. The development contained thousands of apartments inside a limited area. Its buildings had exterior galleries, stairwells, elevators, basements, vacant units, and multiple approaches. A person standing on an upper floor could observe police cars or unfamiliar vehicles entering the grounds. Lookouts could warn sellers below. Drugs and money could be moved between apartments before officers reached the correct floor. When elevators were working, customers could move quickly through a building. When elevators failed, the stairwells created narrow routes where movement could be watched and controlled. A high-rise could therefore become more than a residence. It could function as a marketplace with its own entrances, observation points, storage areas, and security system. This did not mean that every building was controlled in the same way. Cabrini-Green was never one uniform territory. Different gangs held influence in different buildings, and control changed over time. The Black Gangster Disciples, Cobra Stones, Vice Lords, and other organisations had competed in the area before the crack era. A 1983 account described a major outbreak of violence between the Vice Lords and the Disciples over dominance in the development, showing that territorial conflict was already active before crack became the central commodity of the later drug trade. The new drug intensified an existing struggle rather than creating one from nothing. Before crack, a gang might value a building because members lived there. because rivals lived nearby, or because the location provided influence. After crack, control of an entrance or gallery could produce cash every hour. Territory became financially measurable. A building with steady customer traffic was not merely a symbol of status, it was a business location. That changed the meaning of a hallway. For a resident, a lobby was the place between the street and home. For a dealer, it could be the first point of contact with customers. For a gang, it could be an area that needed to be controlled. For police, it could be a place where everyone present was treated as a possible suspect. Those different uses overlapped. An elderly woman returning with groceries might have to pass through a group of buyers waiting near the entrance. A child walking home from school might recognize the person acting as lookout. A parent could know that drugs were being sold nearby while also knowing that confronting the sellers could place the family in danger. The residents did not have the option of avoiding the marketplace entirely. Their homes were inside it. This was one of the central differences between Cabrini-Green and a commercial entertainment district where drugs might be sold. A customer could enter, make a purchase, and leave. Residents had to wake up there, take children to school, carry laundry, receive visitors, and return at night. The same elevator used for a drug transaction was needed by a mother with a stroller. The same stairwell where money changed hands was part of a child's route to the apartment. The drug business depended on these ordinary movements because they provided cover. A crowded lobby did not immediately reveal who was selling, who was buying, and who simply lived in the building. Dealers could stand among residents. Lookouts could appear to be talking with friends. Packages could be transferred quickly. Cash could be moved to an apartment where another person counted it. The organisation became more structured as profits increased. At the lowest level were the people visible to the customer. They might call out a product name, direct buyers, or carry a small supply. Lookouts watched for police and rivals. Others held the main quantity of drugs away from the immediate sales point. Someone collected money. Someone enforced discipline. Higher-ranking members arranged larger purchases and decided how territory would operate. This division of labour reduced risk for the people at the top. If a young seller was arrested, the larger supply might remain hidden. Another person could replace him. The market continued. For teenagers growing up around Cabrini-Green, the contrast between the legal and illegal economies could be difficult to ignore. The legal economy offered limited work, low wages, and long searches for employment. Manufacturing jobs had disappeared from Chicago neighborhoods. Many positions had moved to suburban areas that were difficult to reach without a car. Employers could reject an applicant after hearing an address associated with public housing. Schools operating under severe pressure did not always provide a clear path to stable employment. The crack market offered cash immediately. That did not mean every young person joined it, and it did not mean those who did were unaware of the danger. Most residents were not gang members or dealers. Many parents worked constantly to keep children away from illegal activity. Churches, schools, sports programs, and neighborhood organizations tried to provide alternatives. The market remained persuasive because it was visible. A teenager could watch someone only a few years older buy clothes, carry money, and receive attention from adults in the gang. The wealth might be temporary. The dealer might be arrested, injured, or killed. Still, the cash was real at a time when other opportunities often felt distant. The work also had a schedule. A low-level participant might be assigned a shift, given a small quantity to sell, and expected to return a specific amount of money. The arrangement could resemble a job stripped of every protection that makes legitimate employment tolerable. There was no legal contract, no safe workplace, and no method of resolving disputes except the authority of the organisation. Failure could produce debt. Theft could produce punishment. A missing package could become a matter of life and death. The language of business did not make the trade less violent. It explained why the violence became systematic. A profitable sales location had to be defended from rivals. Customers had to believe the supply would remain available. Sellers had to follow orders. Residents had to be discouraged from cooperating with police. Weapons became part of the operating cost. Chicago's gangs were not the Bloods and Crips structure associated with Los Angeles. Cabrini-Green had its own organisations, rivalries and alliances. The gangster disciples became especially powerful in Chicago's public housing drug markets, while vice lords, Cobra Stones and other groups maintained influence in particular areas. Federal assessments later described crack retailing in Chicago as an open-air market dominated by highly organised African-American street gangs that controlled purchasing, conversion, packaging and street distribution. At Cabrini-Green, architecture gave these organisations a level of control that was difficult to reproduce on an ordinary street. Someone positioned on a high gallery could watch several approaches. A lookout could signal through a shout, whistle or hand movement. A seller could disappear into a building faster than an officer could determine which apartment he had entered. A weapon could be passed through a doorway and vanish. Vacant units increased the advantage. An empty apartment with a broken lock could become storage space, a place for packaging drugs or somewhere to hide after a shooting. If the housing authority failed to secure it, gang members could use public property as part of the market. Broken lighting helped as well. Dark corridors made identification difficult. Residents could hear movement without seeing faces clearly. Police entering an unlit stairwell faced danger from above and below. Dealers who knew every turn held an advantage over outsiders. The deterioration of the buildings therefore became economically useful to the drug trade. A repaired door, working light or secured apartment reduced opportunity. Neglect expanded it. Residents understood this relationship long before policymakers described it in formal reports. They complained about lights, locks, elevators and vacant apartments because they knew maintenance was also security. A broken fixture was not simply ugly. It changed who could control a space. By the late 1980s, crack markets in Chicago public housing had become increasingly visible and profitable. Buyers travelled from surrounding neighbourhoods, and the concentration of sales turned some entrances into crowded commercial points. The scene could resemble an outdoor market, except the product was illegal, and the people managing it were armed. Federal drug assessments later found that most crack purchases surveyed in Chicago took place outdoors and usually in the buyer's own neighbourhood, reflecting the growth of open-air selling across the city. Cabrini-Green's location added another advantage. The development stood near downtown, affluent neighbourhoods and major roads. It was closer to wealthy areas than many of Chicago's other large public housing complexes. Customers did not have to travel to the distant south side. They could reach the near north side and enter a market operating within sight of expensive apartments. The contrast became difficult to miss. On one side of the neighbourhood, property values were rising. Inside Cabrini-Green, gangs were building an economy out of the failure of the legal one. Money entered the project, but it did not produce the kind of stability associated with healthy commerce. A legitimate grocery store pays suppliers, employees, taxes and rent, while providing a service that residents can use safely. The crack market extracted money from addiction and used part of its income to protect itself through weapons, intimidation and recruitment. It created employment of a kind, but employment that damaged the community supporting it. The customer's return meant another sale. It also meant another household losing money needed for food or rent. Addiction altered family routines. A parent might disappear for hours. Household possessions could be sold. Relatives took in children. Grandmothers and older siblings assumed responsibilities they had not expected. Arguments over money became frequent. Residents who had already survived poverty now faced a product capable of taking what little stability remained. Crack did not affect every user in the same way, and the most extreme stories often received the most attention. Some people used drugs without immediately losing housing or family connections. Others entered periods of severe dependency. Treatment was difficult to obtain, and public discussion frequently treated addiction as a moral failure rather than a health problem. The federal response made this distinction even sharper. During the 1980s, politicians described crack as an exceptional threat requiring severe punishment. News reports often used images of black neighbourhoods and public housing to represent the entire crisis. Laws imposed dramatically different penalties for crack and powdered cocaine, even though both were forms of the same drug. The difference meant that low-level crack defendants, disproportionately black, received extremely long sentences compared with many powder cocaine defendants. For Cabrini-Green, the national panic produced more police attention without repairing the conditions that had helped the market grow. Officers could arrest a seller. They could not create a job. They could seize a package. They could not make an elevator work the next morning. They could clear a lobby for several hours. They could not provide long-term supervision, treatment, or safe recreation for the children who lived above it. This did not make enforcement unnecessary. Residents regularly asked for protection and wanted dealers removed from their buildings. The problem was that police operations often treated the entire development as enemy territory. A raid could begin with officers entering in large numbers, stopping young men, searching common areas, and forcing people against walls. Residents who had requested help could find themselves handled as suspects. Children watched officers carrying heavy weapons through the same corridors they used every day. The police faced real danger. Armed gang members fired at rivals and sometimes at officers. The layout of the buildings made entry difficult. A person on an upper gallery had a clear view of police below, while officers could not easily determine where shots had come from. Fear operated in both directions. Police approached expecting ambush. Residents approached expecting humiliation or force. Dealers benefited from the distrust between them. A person who witnessed a shooting had to calculate more than the question of right and wrong. Would the police protect the witness afterward? Would officers reveal where the information came from? Would the accused person return to the building? Could a family be moved if threats began? Silence was often described as support for gangs. In many cases, it was a survival decision. The market also changed sound. Residents had always heard arguments, music, traffic, and children outside. Crack-era commerce added repeated signals. Whistles when police entered, shouted warnings between floors, customers calling from below, and gunshots connected to unpaid debts or territorial disputes. A single gunshot inside a high-rise did not remain a private event. The sound moved through concrete and open air. It echoed between buildings. People near windows moved back. Parents counted children. Neighbours telephoned one another to ask where the shooting had occurred. The difficulty was not always knowing that danger existed. It was knowing where it was. A shot fired from an upper gallery could travel across open ground or into another building. Residents learned which rooms were safest during gunfire. Some placed furniture near windows or told children to sleep low to the floor. Everyday household decisions began to include the direction from which bullets were most likely to come. Profit made these risks more frequent. When a gang controlled a productive location, rivals had an incentive to challenge it. An insult that might once have ended in a fight could become tied to a larger struggle over money. A killing demanded retaliation because failing to respond could make an organization appear weak. Retaliation could strike the wrong person, creating another conflict. The crack market did not simply increase the number of disputes, it gave gangs the resources to continue them. Money purchased weapons, vehicles, bail and loyalty. It allowed leaders to pay participants and support imprisoned members. A successful organization could recruit more young people and expand into additional buildings. The same money created internal conflict. Members argued over shares, sellers hid revenue, leaders competed. Someone accused of stealing could be beaten or killed. The organization demanded discipline because a market operating all day could not depend entirely on friendship. Residents were forced to understand rules they had not agreed to. A particular entrance might belong to one group. A certain elevator might be used for sales. A visitor wearing the wrong colour or known to come from a rival area could create danger. Teenagers learned to explain where they lived and whom they knew. A short walk across the development could cross an invisible boundary. These boundaries were not shown on city maps. They were understood through warnings, rumours and experience. The outside world increasingly treated Cabrini-Green as one criminal location, but inside it, geography became more specific than ever. One building could be relatively calm while another experienced open selling. One floor might be watched by residents, another controlled by gang members. A family could move only a short distance and enter a different set of risks. This unevenness explains why former residents often remember Cabrini-Green in ways that appear to contradict one another. One person remembers fear, gunfire and dealers controlling the lobby. Another remembers friends, community events and adults who looked after every child. Both memories can be accurate. The drug market occupied the same physical space as family life, without completely replacing it. Children still went to school in the morning. Adults still went to work. People cooked dinner, celebrated birthdays, attended church and complained about the weather. A shooting might occur at one end of the development while residents held a barbecue at the other. Life did not stop because the neighbourhood became dangerous. It became more complicated. The phrase crack arrived overnight hides that complication. It suggests that the drug alone descended on Cabrini-Green and destroyed a healthy community. The truth is less convenient. The community had already been weakened by segregation, unemployment, inadequate maintenance and political neglect. Gangs had already established authority. Police and residents already distrusted one another. The buildings already contained dark corridors and unsecured spaces. Crack entered those conditions and made them profitable. That was its real power. It turned neglect into infrastructure. The broken elevator delayed residents, but slowed police. The dark gallery frightened families but protected sellers. The vacant apartment represented public failure but offered private storage. The unemployed teenager represented a social crisis but also a recruit. By the end of the 1980s, the business no longer looked temporary. Customers knew where to go. Sellers worked assigned locations. Lookouts watched the roads. Gang leaders treated buildings as commercial territory. Residents adjusted their movements around a market that operated beside their front doors. The change had not happened in one night. Still, there was a point when people looked around and understood that something new had taken control of the old problems. The money was faster, the weapons were more visible, the customers returned more often, and the spaces that belonged to everyone, the entrances, elevators, galleries and courtyards, were becoming controlled by people who had discovered that a neglected public building could be turned into a private business. Once that control was established, the next struggle was not simply over selling drugs. It was over who had the authority to decide what happened inside each building, who could enter, who could stand in the lobby, who could use the stairs, and who would be punished for refusing to follow rules the residents had never chosen. By the late 1980s, the most important map of Cabrini-Green was not the one kept by the Chicago Housing Authority. The official map showed building numbers, streets, playgrounds, parking areas, and maintenance offices. It identified which apartments belonged to which towers, and where emergency vehicles were supposed to enter. It treated the development as one large residential complex managed by one public agency. The map understood by residents was much more detailed. It included the buildings where relatives lived, the entrances that remained unlocked, the elevators most likely to stop between floors, and the stairwells that should not be used after dark. It showed which galleries were watched by responsible adults, and which had been taken over by young men working for gangs. It marked invisible boundaries between organisations, even when those boundaries divided people living only a few hundred feet apart. A child could learn this map without ever seeing it written down. The lessons began with simple instructions. Do not use that entrance. Do not take that stairway alone. Do not walk through that building to save time. Do not wear that hat when you visit your cousin. Wait downstairs until someone comes to meet you. If shooting starts, move away from the windows. These were not formal rules posted by the housing authority. They were practical knowledge passed through families, neighbours and friends. The rules changed when gang leadership changed, when a shooting occurred, or when a particular building became active in the drug trade. Someone who had been safe in one location a month earlier could become a target after a dispute involving relatives, friends, or gang members from another part of the development. The phrase "every stairwell had an owner" does not mean that every staircase was occupied constantly by one person. It describes the feeling that common space no longer belonged equally to the people who paid rent there. A gang did not need to own the building legally. It needed to control movement. If its members could decide who stood in the lobby, who used a stairwell and which customers reached a sales point, they possessed a form of authority more immediate than anything printed on a lease. The Chicago Housing Authority remained the owner on paper. Inside the building, ownership could mean something else. The architecture helped create this arrangement. Cabrini-Green's high-rises contained long exterior galleries connecting apartments on each floor. Stairwells stood at the ends or within sections of the buildings. Elevators provided the quickest route between the ground and upper levels, but they were unreliable and frequently damaged. Entrances were difficult to monitor, especially when doors, locks, and intercom systems failed. A person controlling one of these points could influence the movement of hundreds of residents. The lobby was the first checkpoint. During active periods of drug selling, lookouts watched the streets and entrances for police vehicles, rival gang members and unfamiliar customers. They were often younger than the people managing the operation. A lookout did not need to carry the main drug supply. His value came from recognizing danger early and sending a warning through the building. A shout could travel upward through the open galleries. A whistle could be repeated from one floor to another. Someone near the elevator could press buttons or hold a door long enough to slow officers down. Another person could carry drugs into an apartment. Money could be passed to someone who did not appear connected to the sale. By the time police reached the location, the person standing there might possess nothing illegal. This system did not require advanced technology. It depended on human observation and an intimate knowledge of the building. Gang members knew which elevator was working. They knew which stairwell door had been forced open and which vacant apartment could be entered through a damaged lock. They recognized residents who might cooperate with police and visitors who did not belong. They could identify an unmarked police car more quickly than an officer could understand the layout of the tower. The building itself became part of the organization. Police officers experienced the same architecture as a series of obstacles. Entering an unfamiliar high-rise meant moving into a space where people above could watch every step. Exterior galleries exposed officers in the courtyard and near entrances. Stairwells created narrow vertical channels with limited visibility. Elevators could stop unexpectedly, or open onto a floor where officers had no safe cover. A law enforcement study of Cabrini-Green described the special police unit created in 1981 after an intense period of gang violence. The unit was intended to increase police presence and regain control of the development, but the need for such a force reflected how difficult ordinary patrol methods had become inside the complex. The danger was real, but the language of regaining control concealed an uncomfortable question. Control for whom? Residents wanted safe hallways, reliable police assistance, and freedom from armed gangs. They also wanted to enter their own homes without being searched, insulted or treated as members of a criminal organization. A police operation could remove dealers from a lobby while making every young black man in the same lobby feel like a suspect. The distinction between residents and gang members was obvious to people who lived there. It was not always respected by outsiders. A teenager waiting for his mother could be ordered against a wall. A resident carrying cash for rent or groceries could be questioned about where it came from. Visitors might be searched simply because they entered a particular building. Officers arriving after a shooting sometimes found a crowd of frightened people and treated the crowd as hostile. The gangs used this resentment. They presented themselves as people from the community defending the buildings from police intrusion, even while their drug sales and territorial conflicts endangered the same residents. A gang member might carry groceries for an elderly neighbour in the afternoon and participate in an armed dispute that evening. He could help pay for a local event and also threaten someone who refused to cooperate with the organisation. This mixture of assistance and intimidation made gang authority more complicated than simple occupation. Some residents had relatives in the gangs. Some had grown up with the people running the drug market. A mother might despise what her son was doing while still trying to protect him from being killed. A neighbour might accept money for food and refuse to provide information to police. The relationships were personal before they became political. Gang leaders understood that complete hostility from residents made business difficult. A drug operation needed silence, but it also needed a degree of cooperation. Dealers wanted customers to enter without residents repeatedly calling police. They needed apartments for storage and people willing to pass messages. They benefited when children warned them that officers had arrived. Sometimes cooperation was purchased. A gang might help a family pay a bill or provide money for a funeral. It might sponsor a neighbourhood event, buy uniforms for a team, or give cash to someone facing an emergency. These actions did not erase the damage caused by the drug trade, but they created obligations. Sometimes cooperation was forced. A resident who complained too loudly could be threatened. Someone suspected of speaking with police might find a warning written near the apartment or receive a visit from gang members. A witness could be followed. A family might decide that moving was safer than continuing to resist if another apartment could be found. In a building with poor official security, the person capable of immediate violence held enormous power. The police could arrive later. The gang was already upstairs. The stairwells mattered because they were the routes residents used when elevators failed, and elevator failures were common enough to shape daily decisions. A person living on a high floor might wait for an elevator, even when the wait became long because the alternative felt unsafe. An ordinary stairwell in a well-maintained building is a secondary space. It is used during exercise, emergencies, or short trips between floors. At Cabrini-Green, it could be the only route home. The lights might not work. The walls might be covered with graffiti identifying a gang or honouring someone who had been killed. The smell of urine, smoke and damp concrete could remain because cleaning was irregular. Doors leading to floors might be damaged or missing. A person climbing could hear voices above without knowing who was there. The uncertainty was often more frightening than the physical condition. A resident entering the stairwell had to decide whether to continue after hearing movement. Turning around could attract attention. Continuing could bring the person into a drug transaction or confrontation. A child might wait at the bottom until an adult arrived, even if that meant being late for school. Gang members understood the value of this narrow space. A stairwell could be used to store a weapon temporarily, conduct a sale away from open view, or move between floors without waiting for the elevator. It could also become a trap. If rivals entered below while another group controlled the upper exit, there was little room to escape. When violence occurred there, residents heard it through the walls. Footsteps became rapid. Voices rose. A door slammed. Then the sound of gunfire moved through concrete and steel. The person firing might disappear onto another floor before police arrived. Residents opening their doors afterward faced the danger of becoming witnesses. The galleries served a different purpose. Because they were open to the outside, they allowed communication across long distances. A person could call to someone several floors below. Lookouts could observe vehicles entering the grounds. Gang members could display their presence visibly, making it clear who controlled a section of the building. Graffiti reinforced the message. Names, symbols, and memorials marked territory. A gang inscription told rivals that members were active there. It told residents who had influence. It also honoured people killed in earlier conflicts, keeping old disputes visible long after the shooting ended. To an outsider, the graffiti might appear random. To residents, it could contain information. A crossed-out symbol indicated disrespect or a challenge. A new name might show that leadership had changed. A memorial could signal that retaliation was expected. The wall served as an announcement board for a political system operating without official recognition. The gangs of Cabrini-Green were not equal in size or power. The gangster disciples became the dominant organisation in much of the development, while vice lords, Mickey Cobras and other groups maintained influence in particular buildings or sections. Accounts of Cabrini-Green describe long-running competition among these organisations, including violence over territory well before the height of the crack market. The precise boundaries changed, but the general structure remained. A gang's strength depended on numbers, weapons, leadership, and control of profitable locations. Buildings associated with a rival organisation could become dangerous for anyone believed to have connections there. These associations were not always voluntary. A child's address could become an identity. A teenager might be questioned because he came from a particular tower, even if he did not belong to a gang. Friendship with someone from another building could be interpreted as loyalty. Family members living across a boundary complicated movement. This turned short distances into serious journeys. Visiting a cousin required planning. Walking to a store could involve choosing a longer route around a rival area. A school student might leave with a group rather than alone. Adults watched from windows until children reached the correct entrance. Residents called ahead to confirm that a hallway was clear. The development was physically open but socially divided. Cars could pass along the surrounding streets. Wealthy neighbourhoods stood nearby. Downtown Chicago was only a short distance away. Inside Cabrini-Green, however, a few yards of concrete might separate territories governed by different rules. Crack profits made those divisions more valuable. Before the drug market expanded, gang territory provided identity, protection and status. During the crack era, the same territory could generate income. An entrance with steady customer traffic produced money. A gallery with a clear view of police approaches became useful. A tower located near a road or public transit route could attract buyers from outside the development. The organisation controlling the location could charge sellers for permission to operate or place its own members there. Independent dealing became difficult because gangs demanded a share of the profits. Earlier accounts of law enforcement at Cabrini-Green had already described gang influence over illegal markets and the collection of payments from dealers. Crack increased the amount of money available and made the enforcement of those demands more important. The business could operate in shifts. Young sellers appeared at assigned times. Someone else replaced them later. Lookouts changed positions. Money moved upward through the organisation. The person visible to a customer was often far below the person controlling the operation. This arrangement protected leadership and created discipline. A seller who arrived late could lose his position. A worker who hid money could be punished. A person using drugs while working risked attracting attention or losing product. The gangs wanted the sales point to remain active, predictable, and controlled. Disorder was tolerated only when it served the business. This produced a strange form of local government. Gang leaders could prohibit unauthorized theft near a drug market because theft discouraged customers. They could settle disputes between members. They decided who was allowed to sell and who had to leave. They imposed consequences more quickly than housing managers or courts. Their authority was violent and illegitimate, but it filled spaces abandoned by legitimate institutions. The contradiction could be seen in the elevators. Gang members sometimes controlled who entered or used them, according to later accounts from the development. An elevator operator did not hold an official job. He stood near the doors because his organisation controlled the building. Residents might be questioned, delayed, or required to acknowledge that authority before reaching their own apartments. For an elderly resident, this was humiliating. For a child, it could become normal. Children adapt quickly to the rules around them. A young person who grew up at Cabrini-Green could learn to recognise guns, gang symbols and police tactics before understanding the larger history that had placed the family there. He might know how to avoid a sales point, but not why the elevator remained broken for weeks. Play continued in the same environment. Children rode bicycles between buildings, played basketball, and gathered near entrances. They developed games around the structures available to them. Adults organised activities, dance groups, sports, and after-school programs. Former residents have described Cabrini-Green as a close community, where people knew one another and where organised recreation existed alongside gang activity and police aggression. The danger did not remove childhood, it interrupted it. A game stopped when someone shouted that police were coming. Children moved indoors when a rival group entered the grounds. A bull remained outside after gunfire began. Parents called names from windows and galleries, trying to locate everyone quickly. The buildings gave adults a wide view, but the view did not guarantee control. A mother could see a child below and still be separated by 12 floors, a broken elevator, and a stairwell she did not trust. Gun availability increased the consequences of territorial conflict. Earlier gang fights might have involved fists, knives, or a limited number of handguns. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, more powerful semi-automatic weapons appeared in Chicago's illegal market. The exact weapon mattered less than the number of shots that could be fired rapidly across open ground or along a gallery. The design of the development exposed people who had no connection to the dispute. Bullets did not stop at territorial boundaries. They entered windows, walls, and playgrounds. A person firing from an upper floor might be aiming at someone below, but apartments and walkways stood behind the target. A missed shot could travel into another family's home. Residents changed the arrangement of rooms in response. Beds were moved away from windows. Children were told to sleep on the floor during active shooting. Furniture was placed against walls that faced dangerous directions. Lights were kept low so people inside would be less visible from outside. These were household safety measures in a residential development built by the government. Police tactics became more aggressive as gangs strengthened their control. Large groups of officers entered buildings. Tactical teams searched apartments and common areas. Streets were blocked. Young men were stopped and questioned. Operations produced arrests and temporarily disrupted sales. But markets often returned after officers left. A gang did not need to defeat the police directly. It needed to survive the operation. Drugs could be hidden. Low-level workers could be replaced. Lookouts could resume their positions. Customers would return because demand remained. The repeated cycle deepened frustration among residents. People wanted protection, yet the protection arrived as a temporary occupation. Officers entered with force, removed a limited number of suspects and departed without fixing lights, securing vacant units, or ensuring that residents who had cooperated would remain safe. The gang's authority weakened for a few hours. Then the stairwell acquired an owner again. Media coverage usually arrived during the most dramatic moments. Cameras recorded officers in body armour, armed gang members, grieving families, and damaged buildings. These images were real, but repetition made them appear to represent every minute of life. The camera rarely remained after the raid. It did not record the resident climbing the stairs the next morning because the elevator had failed again. It did not follow the child choosing a route to school or the grandmother checking the gallery before leaving her apartment. It did not show the tenant leader demanding repairs from officials who had made the same promise before. This difference mattered because the public came to believe that Cabrini-Green's common spaces were dangerous because the residents had destroyed them. The history was more complicated. Residents did damage property. Gang members broke lights, doors and elevators when darkness or restricted access helped their business. Drug users occupied vacant units. Vandalism increased maintenance costs and made management harder. The Chicago Housing Authority also allowed damage to remain for long periods. A broken light became gang infrastructure because no one replaced it. A damaged lock became an illegal entrance because no one repaired it. A vacant apartment became a storage room because no one secured it. Responsibility did not belong to only one side. The gangs exploited institutional neglect, and institutional neglect expanded because officials viewed the population as impossible to serve. By the early 1990s, control of space inside Cabrini-Green had become a daily negotiation. Residents still possessed legal rights to their apartments. Police still held official authority. The housing authority still managed the property. Yet none of those institutions could guarantee safe passage from the street to a front door. That guarantee might come from a neighbour watching the lobby. It might come from an older relative escorting a child. It might come from knowing the gang member stationed near the elevator. It might disappear after a shooting changed the balance of power. The most dangerous feature of this system was not that gangs controlled every action. They did not. It was that nobody could be completely certain where official authority ended and street authority began. A hallway could feel safe at noon and controlled by evening. A familiar person could become an armed enforcer. A police raid could clear a building and leave residents more exposed afterward. A stairwell used safely for months could become part of a new sales route. The boundaries kept moving, and the people least able to leave had to learn each new arrangement. That was how a housing development became a collection of smaller territories. Each building developed a reputation. Each entrance carried its own risks. Each gallery revealed who was watching. Every trip between an apartment and the street required information. The residents had not surrendered their community. Families continued to challenge gangs, organize programs and demand protection. They maintained homes inside buildings the rest of the city increasingly treated as lost. Yet daily life was now shaped by the question of the movement. Who could come upstairs? Who could stand downstairs? Who could cross the courtyard? Who controlled the elevator? And when someone decided that a boundary had been violated, the punishment rarely remained confined to the people who had created the dispute. The shots moved through common space, through windows and walls, into the rooms where families were trying to carry on with dinner, homework and sleep. Living at Cabrini-Green required residents to hold two versions of the same place in their minds. One version was understood by the people who lived there. It contained family apartments, school mornings, birthday parties, church services, basketball games, friendships and arguments between neighbours who had known one another for years. It contained mothers calling children inside before dark, teenagers practicing dance routines, elderly residents sitting near windows and adults returning from work with groceries. People borrowed food, shared telephones, watched one another's children and carried bags upstairs when the elevators failed. The other version belonged to the outside world. But Cabrini-Green appeared on television after shootings, police raids and political announcements. It was shown through broken windows, fenced galleries, and groups of young men standing near entrances. Reporters described it as a symbol of everything wrong with public housing. Viewers who had never visited Chicago learned to associate the name with gangs, drugs, and danger. Both versions contained parts of the truth. The problem was that only one of them received national attention. A resident could spend an ordinary day inside Cabrini-Green and experience no dramatic event. Breakfast still had to be made. Children still had to reach school. Adults still had appointments, jobs, errands, and relatives who needed help. Laundry accumulated. Bills arrived. Someone needed medicine from the pharmacy. A child forgot a notebook and had to return upstairs. None of those activities disappeared because the neighbourhood had become dangerous. They became harder to complete. The first calculation often began before leaving the apartment. A resident listened. Was the gallery quiet? Were people gathered near the elevator? Had there been shooting during the night? Was the elevator moving, or would the family have to use the stairs? These questions could determine how the morning unfolded. A parent with several children might send the oldest one to check whether the elevator was operating. An elderly resident might wait until a trusted neighbour was ready to leave. Someone carrying a large load could decide to postpone the trip rather than climb 10 or 15 floors through a stairwell that felt unsafe. The building's failures turned simple movements into plans. When an elevator stopped, the inconvenience was distributed unevenly. A healthy teenager could climb several flights. A person with a disability, an older resident, or a parent carrying an infant could become effectively confined to an upper floor. Grocery shopping had to be divided into smaller trips. Furniture became difficult to move. Emergency assistance took longer to arrive. Even when the elevator worked, it could produce anxiety. The doors might open onto a floor controlled by a gang. Someone might enter carrying a weapon. The car could stop between floors. Children learned not to stare, not to repeat conversations, and not to ask questions about what they saw. They learned how to make themselves unremarkable. This was one of the most important skills in a place where attention could become dangerous. Do not look frightened. Do not act curious. Do not appear disrespectful. Do not let someone believe you are carrying information from one building to another. Adults taught these lessons because they wanted children to remain outside the conflicts surrounding them. The lessons were not about approving of gang authority. They were about passing safely through spaces where that authority existed. Parents also tried to preserve routines that had nothing to do with gangs. Children were sent to school in clean clothes. Homework was checked. Meals were prepared. Church attendance remained important for many families. Adults insisted on manners, chores, and curfews. The rules inside an apartment could be strict precisely because the world outside the door felt difficult to control. A mother might tell her son that she did not care what happened in the lobby. Inside the apartment, he would respect her rules. The apartment became a protected zone. Doors were kept locked. Curtains were arranged to reduce visibility from outside. Furniture could be moved away from windows that faced active shooting areas. Younger children were told which room to enter if gunfire began. These precautions became part of household knowledge. They did not always appear dramatic to the people practicing them. Repetition turned them into habits. A child who had been instructed several times to drop to the floor during shooting did not need the order explained again. The sound itself triggered the movement. Families developed different responses. Some gathered in hallways or bathrooms away from windows. Others moved mattresses to the floor. Parents counted children and called relatives in nearby apartments. Neighbours telephoned one another to determine which building or gallery the shots had come from. The uncertainty continued after the sound stopped. Was the shooting finished? Was it safe to turn on lights? Could someone leave to check on a relative? Would police arrive and begin searching the building? A quiet period did not immediately restore normal life. Residents waited for information, and information travelled through informal networks faster than official announcements. Someone had seen a person running. Someone knew which gang was involved. Someone heard that a child had been outside. Someone else said the rumour was wrong. In a dense community, news moved quickly, but accuracy was never guaranteed. That was another burden of living between two worlds. Residents knew far more about local danger than outsiders, yet they often had to make decisions before the facts were clear. Children continued to play outside because remaining indoors constantly was not realistic. Cabrini-Green had a large young population, and its courtyards, playgrounds and open spaces were important gathering places. Former residents have described a community where children played games, participated in dance groups and attended organised after-school activities, even while gangs operated nearby. One former resident recalled Cabrini-Green as resembling a small village in which people knew one another, and where children had access to activities including games, sewing and performances. The phrase small village helps explain why many residents remained emotionally attached to Cabrini-Green. A large housing project could feel anonymous to an outsider. Inside, social life was often intensely personal. People knew which apartment belonged to a friend's grandmother. Adults recognised children by family. News of illness, arrest, employment or death spread quickly. This closeness created protection. A child who misbehaved outside might be corrected by several adults before reaching home. A parent working late could ask a neighbour to watch the children. An elderly resident could send someone younger to a store. Families shared meals when money was short. The same closeness could also make privacy difficult. Everyone might know when a family was struggling, when a teenager had joined a gang, or when someone had begun using drugs. Rumours moved through buildings. Personal conflicts could become public. A disagreement between two young people could involve relatives, friends, and gang connections by the end of the day. Community was not automatically peaceful. It was a network, and networks carry help and conflict with equal efficiency. Employment pulled many adults into a different part of Chicago each day. Residents worked in hospitals, offices, factories, restaurants, hotels, schools, stores, and city services. Domestic workers travelled to private homes in wealthier neighbourhoods. Maintenance employees cleaned buildings that were better managed than the ones in which they lived. Some adults passed through the nearby Gold Coast, where doormen stood at entrances and elevators were repaired quickly. The contrast was unavoidable. Cabrini-Green stood close to some of Chicago's most valuable property. A resident could walk or ride a short distance and enter streets of expensive shops, restaurants, and apartment buildings. The physical gap between poverty and wealth was small. The institutional gap was enormous. In one building, a broken elevator could remain out of service long enough to reshape family routines. A few blocks away, a similar failure would be treated as an urgent problem. Residents did not need a sociologist to explain that difference. They saw it every day. The Cabrini-Green entry in the Encyclopedia of Chicago notes that black residents faced difficulty finding better affordable housing, giving the development a population with limited ability to move elsewhere, while the Housing Authority failed to budget adequately for repairs and landscaping as the buildings deteriorated. This meant that residents were often asked why they did not simply leave. The question assumed that affordable apartments were available, landlords were willing to rent to them, transportation remained manageable, and families could afford deposits and moving costs. It ignored the discrimination that had placed many black families in public housing and continued to restrict their choices outside it. Leaving also meant abandoning support. A parent moving to an unfamiliar neighbourhood could lose nearby relatives, trusted childcare, and relationships built over many years. A safer building might be farther from work. Children might have to change schools. An older resident could become isolated from everyone she knew. People therefore remained for reasons that were practical as well as emotional. Cabrini-Green was dangerous in specific ways, but it was familiar. Familiarity has value when money is limited. A resident knew which store extended credit, which neighbour could watch a child, and which route was safe at a particular hour. Moving meant surrendering that information and beginning again. School stood at the centre of family concerns. Education was supposed to provide a path beyond the conditions surrounding the development. Parents expected children to attend, behave, and complete their work. Yet the school serving Cabrini-Green operated within the same larger system of segregation and concentrated poverty. Students arrived carrying experiences that were difficult to leave at the classroom door. A child might have slept poorly because of gunfire. Another might be worried about a parent using drugs. A student could miss school because elevators were broken. A route felt unsafe, or the family had moved temporarily after a threat. Teachers faced classrooms where children needed academic instruction, as well as emotional stability, meals, supervision, and protection. Schools also offered structure. For several hours, students entered a place governed by schedules, bells, and adults whose authority did not depend on gang territory. Sports, music, art, and after-school programs created reasons to remain involved. A coach or teacher could become one of the few adults able to imagine a child's future beyond the neighbourhood. Residents fought to preserve and improve these institutions. Activist Marion Stamps, who raised 5 daughters at Cabrini-Green, led tenant organising, ran a programme for expectant mothers, and pushed for a new community school, later named for abolitionist Sojourner Truth. Her work reflected a broader tradition of residents demanding services rather than accepting the idea that their neighbourhood could only be managed through police operations. Women often held these efforts together. They attended housing meetings, organised tenant groups, confronted officials, and created programmes for children. They also performed the daily work of keeping families stable, finding food, arranging childcare, visiting schools, attending court hearings, and caring for relatives. Their labour existed between formal institutions, A woman might spend the morning dealing with a housing manager, the afternoon speaking with a teacher, and the evening trying to persuade a teenager to avoid the lobby. Each institution controlled one piece of the problem. She was expected to connect them. Tenant organisers understood that physical repairs and social safety were linked. A working light could discourage crime. A locked vacant apartment could prevent drug storage. A staffed management office could give residents somewhere to report problems. A youth programme could keep children occupied during hours when gangs recruited. A federal evaluation of the Cabrini-Green High Impact Programme described an effort combining architectural improvements, building-level management outposts, youth services, shelter programs, and personal safety education. The evaluation involved interviews with hundreds of residents about crime, employment, and quality of life. It found that crime was widely regarded as the area's most serious problem, demonstrating that residents did not deny the danger surrounding them. They objected to being defined by it. The distinction mattered during encounters with police. Residents called officers after shootings, robberies, and threats. They wanted illegal weapons removed and drug markets disrupted. At the same time, many remembered aggressive searches, insults and sweeps in which young men were treated as gang members because of their age and address. A parent could fear gangs and police in different ways. Gang members threatened immediate retaliation. Police officers possessed legal authority and could arrest, search, or use force. A family caught between them had few safe choices. Providing information to police might help remove a dangerous person, but it could also expose the family to retaliation. Refusing to cooperate could leave the same person in control of the building. Complaining publicly about police conduct could cause officers to view residents as hostile. Supporting aggressive enforcement could make neighbours believe the family had invited occupation. Every position carried a risk. Children observed these contradictions. They saw adults call police during emergencies and criticise police afterward. They saw gang members frighten neighbours and then help someone carry groceries. They heard teachers insist that rules mattered while watching illegal organisations control common space. This did not mean children were unable to distinguish right from wrong. It meant they understood early that authority could be inconsistent. The housing authority owned the building but could not keep it repaired. Police enforced the law but could not remain after a raid. Parents controlled the apartment but not the gallery outside. Gang members had no legal authority but could impose immediate consequences. Learning to move among these systems required judgment that children in safer neighbourhoods were rarely asked to develop. Teenagers faced the sharpest pressure. They wanted independence at the same age that parents became most afraid to let them move freely. A boy walking with friends could be mistaken for a gang group by police. Gang members could interpret neutrality as weakness or hidden loyalty. A young person refusing recruitment still had to live among those doing the recruiting. Some joined for money, others joined for protection, friendship, identity, or family connections. A teenager whose brother or cousin belonged to a gang could be treated as affiliated even without formally joining. Once rivals believed the connection existed, avoiding participation became more difficult. Many resisted. They joined sports teams, found jobs, attended church, or stayed close to adults who could protect them. Some left the neighbourhood whenever possible. Others created identities based on music, school, art, or work. Former resident James Lockhart later wrote that growing up at Cabrini-Green shaped him deeply, and remembered the neighbourhood as home rather than merely a place of danger. His parents had moved there for affordable housing, and his recollection emphasised belonging, relationships, and the uncertainty residents felt as redevelopment began changing the area. Stories like his complicate the idea that every child was waiting to escape. A person can want safer conditions without rejecting the community. A resident can hate the gunfire and love the people living nearby. A family can criticise the buildings and still call them home. That emotional distinction was often lost when outsiders discussed demolition. To a city official, a tower could represent concentrated poverty and failed architecture. To a resident, it contained the apartment where children were raised, the hallway where neighbours gathered, and the last address shared with a relative who had died. The building could be both damaged and meaningful. Daily pleasure survived inside it. Music played from windows and portable radios. Families held parties. Children performed routines. Food was shared at cookouts. Churches organised events. People dressed carefully for school, work and Sunday services. Photographs from Cabrini-Green do not show only fear. They show children smiling, adults dancing and residents gathering in apartments. The National Public Housing Museum later emphasised these forms of joy and community in its effort to challenge stereotypes, including an image of residents dancing at a Cabrini-Green house party. Museum organisers argued that public housing history had to include what residents accomplished and endured, not only the conditions imposed on them. Humour also survived. People joked about broken elevators, difficult neighbours, and the strange behaviour of outsiders. Residents created nicknames for places and people. Children invented frightening stories about empty floors and dark stairwells, turning real architectural danger into local mythology. Laughter did not mean the problems were minor, it meant people needed ways to live with them. The outside world often expected only two responses from Cabrini-Green residents: despair or criminality. Ordinary emotional life was harder to fit into the story. Pride seemed incompatible with poverty. Happiness appeared to contradict danger. Residents knew there was no contradiction. A birthday cake still tasted good in a damaged building. A child still felt proud after winning a game. A family still celebrated a graduation. A neighbour's death still produced grief whether or not television cameras arrived. The most painful moments were often those in which private loss became public spectacle. When a child or innocent resident was killed, reporters entered the development. Cameras gathered near the family's building. Officials promised action. Police presence increased. The victims' relatives were asked to describe their pain to strangers. Then attention moved elsewhere. Residents remained with the empty apartment, the memorial, and the knowledge that the conditions surrounding the death had not disappeared. This repeated pattern taught skepticism. Political leaders announced new programs. Police launched special operations. Housing officials promised repairs. Residents had heard similar statements before. They judged policy through practical questions. Would the elevators work? Would vacant apartments be secured? Would children have somewhere safe to go after school? Would police respond when called without treating everyone as a suspect? Would families be allowed to remain if the neighbourhood became valuable? These questions connected the immediate crisis to the future. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, land around Cabrini-Green was becoming increasingly desirable. The development's location near downtown and affluent near-north neighbourhoods made it different from many isolated public housing complexes. Rising property values created pressure to redevelop the area. The Encyclopedia of Chicago notes that this increase in surrounding real estate value later led housing officials to propose replacing the complex with mixed-income housing, while residents feared permanent displacement. Residents could see the change approaching. New investment appeared nearby. Wealthier newcomers entered surrounding areas. The same location once treated as undesirable was becoming valuable. This created another division between worlds. Cabrini-Green residents were told their neighbourhood was too dangerous to preserve. Developers looked at the same land and saw opportunity. The buildings were described as beyond repair, but the location beneath them was suddenly worth a great deal. Families began to suspect that safety was not the only reason officials wanted the towers removed. Their suspicion would shape every later discussion about redevelopment. Before demolition became the central issue, residents continued living through the immediate demands of the day. The children had to come inside. Dinner had to be prepared. Someone needed to check whether the elevator was working. Someone else had to attend a tenant meeting. As evening settled over Cabrini-Green, the contrast with the surrounding city became sharper. Lights appeared in the Gold Coast buildings nearby. Traffic continued toward restaurants and shops. In the towers, residents looked across galleries, watched entrances and listened for changes in the sound below. Inside an apartment, a family might be watching television. A child completed homework at the table. A mother prepared clothes for the next morning. A neighbour knocked to borrow something. Nothing about the scene would have looked unusual if the apartment had been located somewhere else. Outside the door, the building followed another set of rules. The same family lived in both places at once, the private world they worked to maintain, and the public world that outsiders assumed defined them completely. Keeping those worlds separate required constant effort. A parent could close the door but not stop the sound of gunfire. A teacher could open a classroom but not remove the danger from the route home. A tenant organiser could demand repairs but not force the housing authority to care. A police raid could interrupt the drug market, but not replace the authority that returned when officers left. Normal life continued because residents continued producing it. They created routines inside conditions that repeatedly disrupted routine. They protected children in spaces they did not fully control. They built community while being told no community existed. That work remained largely invisible until violence interrupted it. And as shootings became more frequent and police operations more aggressive, the distance between Cabrini-Green's two worlds became harder to maintain. The danger outside was beginning to enter apartments, schools and playgrounds with greater force, while the city prepared to answer the crisis not with the steady rebuilding residents had requested, but with tactics designed for a war. The war did not begin when police entered Cabrini-Green. Residents had already been living with armed conflict for years. Gang members fired from galleries and windows. Rival organisations fought over buildings, drug markets and personal disputes. Families listened for shots before crossing courtyards. Children were taught to move away from windows. Ambulances sometimes waited until police confirmed that an area was secure. What changed during the 1980s and early 1990s was the way government described and answered the violence. Officials increasingly used the language of occupation, control and reclamation. Police units entered in larger numbers. Buildings were searched floor by floor, entrances were guarded, residents were stopped, questioned, and required to prove that they belonged in their own homes. Tactical operations that might have seemed extraordinary elsewhere became regular features of life in public housing. The city said it was taking the buildings back. Residents were left to ask who the buildings had belonged to before the operation began. The police response at Cabrini-Green did not start with crack cocaine. It had developed during an earlier period of gang violence. In 1970, Chicago established a program known as Walk and Talk at Cabrini-Green. Officers were expected to leave their patrol cars, walk through the development and speak with residents. The approach reflected lessons drawn from the urban uprisings of the 1960s. The Kerner Commission, created after major civil disorders in American cities, had criticised aggressive and distant police tactics that deepened hostility in black communities. The theory behind Walk and Talk was simple. Officers who knew residents personally might receive better information. Residents who recognised individual officers might be more willing to report danger. Police would become part of neighbourhood life rather than an outside force appearing only after a crime. Personal contact could help, but it did not resolve the larger conditions. The buildings continued deteriorating. Gangs expanded their influence. Weapons entered the development. Police officers faced sniper fire from upper floors. Residents remained suspicious of a department with a long history of racial discrimination and brutality. By early 1981, violence at Cabrini-Green had reached a level that demanded public attention. During the first 3 months of that year, a series of gang conflicts produced repeated shootings, killings, robberies and assaults. Contemporary reporting described 11 murders, at least 130 shootings and 120 stabbings during the period before Mayor Jane Byrne moved into the development. Gangs armed with rifles and sawed-off shotguns were accused of controlling buildings, drug activity and extortion operations. Those numbers were more than statistics to residents. They represented bullets moving between towers, people killed near entrances, and families afraid to leave apartments. The violence could continue through the night. Gang members sometimes used upper floors as firing positions. Police officers entering the grounds could be observed long before they reached the correct building. The city's response became one of the most famous political performances in Chicago history. Mayor Jane Byrne announced that she and her husband would move into an apartment at Cabrini-Green. She presented the decision as a demonstration that the city would remove troublemakers and restore safety. Byrne maintained her private Gold Coast residence nearby, and critics immediately questioned whether the move represented genuine commitment or political theatre. She stayed at Cabrini for only a limited period, protected by bodyguards and a large police presence unavailable to ordinary residents. Her arrival nevertheless produced rapid action. Police manpower increased. Officers filled streets and common areas. A special proactive unit adopted a highly visible and aggressive enforcement posture, using foot patrols, ordinary squad cars, and small three-wheeled vehicles. Off-duty officers were hired to expand the patrol force, nearly doubling police manpower in the community. Between May 1981 and January 1982, officers followed a full enforcement policy that reduced their discretion and produced a sharp rise in arrests. A later Justice Department case study credited the program with a dramatic decline in serious crime during that period. The phrase full enforcement meant that violations previously handled with warnings could result in arrest. Police were instructed to enforce rules consistently and visibly. The objective was not only to solve major crimes, it was to impose order throughout the development. Public drinking, disorderly conduct, trespassing, and minor offences became part of the campaign. The approach provided immediate relief for some residents. Open gunfire decreased while the police presence remained intense. People could cross areas that had recently been controlled by armed gang members. Firefighters and paramedics entered buildings with less fear. The city repaired facilities and delivered services that residents had requested for years. Chicago Magazine later described the scale of Byrne's campaign. 7 liquor stores in the area were closed for building or electrical violations. Hundreds of families were evicted, including some accused of illegally housing parolees connected to gangs. A misdemeanor court was opened near the development. A retired Army Major General who had commanded Green Berets was placed in charge of security at Cabrini-Green. 50 federal agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms were assigned to investigate gun trafficking. About 150 police officers participated in one raid on apartments believed to be vacant. The selection of a former military commander was significant. It showed how city leaders had begun to understand the housing project. Cabrini-Green was not being treated only as a neighbourhood requiring services and normal police protection. It was being treated as territory requiring a security command. Military experience did not automatically make policing abusive. Gang members carried dangerous weapons and used the buildings tactically. Officers needed coordination, equipment, and planning to enter safely. The problem was that military thinking divides space into controlled and uncontrolled areas. It identifies threats, secures positions, and measures success through domination of territory. A residential community contains different obligations. The people inside are not simply a population to be controlled. They are citizens with homes, rights, families, and reasons to move through the area. When those two ways of understanding space came together, residents became difficult to classify. A person standing in a lobby might be a dealer, lookout, visitor, or tenant waiting for a child. An apartment might be vacant, illegally occupied, or temporarily used by relatives of the legal tenant. A young man running from officers might be carrying drugs, avoiding harassment, or trying to reach home before an entrance was closed. Police had to make decisions quickly in dangerous conditions. Those decisions often relied on assumptions about age, clothing, location, and race. The pressure for immediate results encouraged broad enforcement. A large raid could produce weapons and arrests. It also allowed officials to show television viewers that action was being taken. Officers moving through galleries in formation created stronger images than maintenance workers repairing doors one at a time. The cameras usually arrived with the police. Residents watched reporters stand outside buildings and describe the operation. News broadcasts showed officers, suspects, and confiscated weapons. The coverage reinforced the idea that Cabrini-Green was a combat zone. The phrase was used openly. A Washington Post report published during Burns' stay described the development as a vertical ghetto and presented the sudden calm as the result of the mayor's presence and a small army of police officers. The report also noted that drug dealing and gang extortion continued even after visible gunfire declined. That detail explained the limits of saturation policing. Police could force armed members away from open areas. They could make it harder to carry rifles in public. They could arrest hundreds of people. The gang structure remained. Leaders stayed out of sight. Money collection continued. Drug operations adapted. Weapons were hidden instead of displayed. Members waited for the political attention and additional officers to leave. Residents understood that temporary calm was not the same as lasting safety. Jane Byrne eventually returned to her Gold Coast home. Additional services slowed. News coverage moved to other stories. The conditions that had allowed gangs to grow remained: unemployment, deteriorating buildings, limited youth programs, weak management, and a housing authority unable to control entrances or secure vacant apartments. The special police presence had demonstrated that the city could concentrate resources at Cabrini-Green. Its disappearance demonstrated that the city had chosen not to maintain them before the crisis. The lesson was difficult to ignore. Officials had repaired more and provided more services during a few weeks of national attention than residents had received during years of requests. The city could act quickly when the mayor lived there and cameras were watching. Once she left, urgency faded. Gang violence returned. In August 1983, 10 young men were wounded during a new outbreak of conflict, involving vice lords and disciples competing for dominance in Cabrini-Green. Police described several sniper attacks and announced that patrols would again be increased. The pattern became familiar. A shooting occurred. Police flooded the area. Arrests were made. The visible violence decreased. Officers were reassigned. The underlying market and territorial structure survived. Crack cocaine made this cycle more difficult to break. The profits allowed gangs to replace arrested workers, purchase weapons, and maintain continuous operations. Police could not shut down a market permanently by removing the people standing at the entrance on one afternoon. Enforcement, therefore, became more intrusive. Officers entered common areas and apartments. Tactical teams searched vacant units. Residents were questioned about visitors. Housing rules were used alongside criminal law. Families could face eviction for allowing unauthorized people to stay, even when the person was a relative or partner. Some evictions targeted households genuinely protecting gang members or storing weapons. Others placed women in impossible positions. A mother might have an adult son connected to a gang. She could fear his behavior and still refuse to make him homeless. A woman might allow the father of her children to stay temporarily, even though his name was not on the lease. If he was arrested or identified as a gang member, the entire household could be threatened with removal. The policy treated the leaseholder as responsible for everyone entering the apartment. That gave authorities a tool for pressuring families to exclude suspected offenders. It also meant that children and uninvolved relatives could lose housing because of one person's conduct. The boundaries of the war moved through the front door. Police surveillance was not limited to dramatic raids. Officers maintained observation of entrances, suspected sales points, and people believed to be gang leaders. Undercover officers entered the development. Informants provided information. Patrol officers recorded names and associations. The work created constant uncertainty. Residents did not know who was speaking with police. Gang members suspected rivals and neighbours. Police suspected residents of concealing information. A person could become dangerous to know. the relationship between officers and gang leaders was not always openly confrontational. Some police developed informal contacts with people holding street authority. These relationships could be used to prevent shootings, locate weapons, or arrange temporary truces. By the early 1990s, 3 Cabrini-Green officers known as the Slick Boys used rap performances, basketball, and youth counselling to build relationships with residents. They had grown up in Chicago public housing and tried to reach young people in ways traditional patrol officers could not. A later Harvard case study described officers who were willing to negotiate with gang leaders to establish truces, raising ethical concerns about whether such agreements reduced danger while allowing criminal organizations to operate within accepted limits. This approach acknowledged a fact officials rarely wanted to admit. Gang leaders possessed enough power that police sometimes treated them as people capable of enforcing peace. A truce could save lives. It could also legitimize the authority of the organization. If officers asked a gang leader to control his members, they were confirming that he controlled the building. If police tolerated certain illegal activities in exchange for reduced shooting, residents might reasonably ask whether law enforcement had accepted gang government. There was no simple answer. Arresting every member at once was impossible. Ignoring the leadership allowed violence to continue. Negotiating could protect residents temporarily, while strengthening the same structure causing the danger. The city shifted between these strategies: enforcement, negotiation, community policing, and highly publicized crackdowns. The most consequential crackdown came in October 1992. On the morning of October 13th, 7-year-old Dantrell Davis left his Cabrini-Green apartment with his mother and began walking toward Jenner Elementary School. He was struck and killed by a bullet fired from a high-rise. Police said the shooting was connected to a gang conflict and that the child was not the intended target. The death created outrage across Chicago. Children had been injured and killed at Cabrini-Green before, but the circumstances became impossible for city leaders to treat as another statistic. Dantrell was walking to school beside his mother. The shooting occurred in daylight. The image of a child killed during an ordinary morning journey focused public anger on the development. Mayor Richard M. Daley announced a broad security plan. 4 high-rise buildings with many vacant apartments would be closed. Police would conduct sweeps searching for weapons, drugs, and gang members. Rear exits would receive one-way turnstiles. Front entrances would be equipped with metal detectors. Ground-floor apartments in Chicago Housing Authority high-rises would be sealed to prevent people from bringing guns into the buildings. The operation began quickly. Police searched towers while carpenters constructed controlled entry points. Armed guards were planned for entrances. Residents would be required to show identification cards. The 4 buildings selected for closure included the tower from which the fatal shot was believed to have been fired. To officials, the measures were practical. If gangs used uncontrolled entrances, the entrances would be restricted. If weapons entered the buildings, residents and visitors would pass through metal detectors. If vacant apartments provided hiding places, the buildings would be emptied and sealed. The response also transformed residential towers into structures resembling secure institutions. Residents would no longer enter simply because they lived there. They would have to prove it at a checkpoint. Visitors could be searched and recorded. Guards would determine who belonged. People living in private apartment buildings nearby were not required to pass metal detectors before reaching home. At Cabrini-Green, the measure was presented as protection. Some residents welcomed it. They were tired of weapons entering the buildings. They wanted strangers and customers kept away. A controlled entrance could reduce drug traffic and make hallways safer. Others saw another temporary crackdown that would fail after public attention disappeared. One resident watching the 1992 searches predicted that everything would return within 6 months. Experience supported his skepticism. Security systems required staffing and maintenance. Metal detectors were useless if guards abandoned their posts, if side doors remained broken, or if gang members controlled apartments above the entrance. Turnstiles could be damaged. Identification rules could be enforced aggressively against residents, while familiar dealers found ways around them. The closures created another problem. Families living in the selected buildings had to move. The city described the towers as dangerous and underoccupied, but the remaining apartments were still homes. Residents faced relocation within public housing or into unfamiliar neighbourhoods. Social networks were broken. Children changed routes, and sometimes schools. Elderly tenants lost nearby support. Closing a building reduced the number of spaces gangs could use. It also removed residents who had spent years trying to stabilise those spaces. The security campaign after Dantrell Davis's death revealed the central contradiction of policing Cabrini-Green. The city had a duty to protect residents from armed gangs. It often attempted to fulfill that duty by placing the residents under greater control. Every person was affected by the measures created for a smaller number of offenders. Everyone passed the checkpoint. Everyone encountered the sweep. Every household faced stricter visitor rules. Every young man risked being treated as a gang member. Safety and freedom were presented as opposing choices. Residents were told that extraordinary danger required extraordinary measures. Many agreed that something had to change. They had requested action repeatedly. What they had requested was not only force. They wanted working elevators, secure doors, reliable lighting, staffed management offices, youth programs, employment and police officers who knew residents well enough to distinguish them from outsiders. Those measures required continuing investment. A raid required one large deployment. The city repeatedly chose the visible response. This did not mean the police operations achieved nothing. Weapons were seized, wanted offenders were arrested, open sales could be interrupted. Families sometimes experienced periods of greater safety after a building was secured. The gains were difficult to preserve because policing was being asked to correct failures created by housing, labour, education and health policy. Health. An officer could arrest a dealer but could not reduce the number of customers addicted to crack. A tactical team could clear a vacant apartment but could not force the housing authority to renovate it. A guard could inspect identification but could not provide a teenager with employment. A police commander could negotiate a truce but could not remove the reasons gangs had become a source of income, identity and protection. As the city increased security, the physical appearance of Cabrini-Green changed. More fencing appeared. Entrances became restricted. Windows and galleries were enclosed. Vacant buildings were sealed. The measures were intended to contain danger, but they strengthened the public image of the development as a prison. Television viewers saw cages, guards and armed officers. They rarely saw the policy choices that had made those measures seem necessary. Residents saw both. They knew the gangs had turned galleries and stairwells into strategic positions. They also knew the housing authority had left those spaces dark and damaged. They understood that police faced gunfire. They also knew that officers could leave while families remained. The war came home because home had become the battlefield on which every institution tried to solve its own problem. Gang organizations defended drug territory. Police defended state authority. Politicians defended their reputations. The housing authority defended its remaining property. Residents defended apartments, children, and the routines of daily life. Only one of those groups had no safe place to withdraw. Police ended their shifts. Reporters packed their equipment. Officials returned downtown. Gang leaders could hide or move operations. The families stayed inside the buildings. They passed the new guards, climbed through the same stairwells and waited to see whether the latest crackdown would last longer than the ones before it. At the same time, another question was becoming impossible to avoid. If Chicago could not make Cabrini-Green safe through ordinary government, repairs or repeated police operations, city leaders would eventually decide that the buildings themselves had to disappear. The police checkpoints remained after the television crews left. Residents continued showing identification at entrances. Guards continued deciding who could enter. Metal detectors continued sounding when someone carried keys, tools, or another ordinary object through the doorway. The buildings selected for closure were gradually emptied, their remaining families transferred elsewhere. The killing of 7-year-old Dantrell Davis had forced Chicago to look at Cabrini-Green again, but looking was not the same as understanding. City officials described the security operation as a turning point. Police commanders announced searches and arrests. Housing administrators promised tighter control of entrances and vacant apartments. Political leaders said that children had the right to walk to school without passing through gunfire. Residents agreed with that statement. They had been saying it for years. What they questioned was why the city seemed capable of urgent action only after a child's death became a public scandal. Broken elevators had not created the same urgency. Unsecured apartments had not done it. Repeated complaints about guns, dark stairwells and open drug sales had produced temporary responses, followed by a return to the same conditions. The city could no longer pretend that Cabrini-Green's violence was an isolated problem caused only by a few criminals. It also could not admit easily that public institutions had helped create the environment in which those criminals operated. That left demolition as an increasingly attractive answer. A damaged building can be blamed on its occupants, its design, or its age. Once it is demolished, officials no longer have to explain why they failed to maintain it. The empty land appears to offer a clean beginning. Political leaders can present removal as progress, even when the conditions that shape the old community remain unresolved. At Cabrini-Green, the pressure to clear the high-rises was strengthened by something that had little to do with public safety. The land had become extremely valuable. During the years when Cabrini-Green deteriorated, the neighbourhoods around it changed. River North became a centre for galleries, restaurants, offices and expensive residential development. The Gold Coast remained one of Chicago's wealthiest districts. Warehouses were converted into lofts. New buildings rose on land that investors had once ignored. By the middle of the 1990s, expensive property surrounded Cabrini-Green. Residents remained poor, but the ground beneath them was no longer considered undesirable. This changed the meaning of every discussion about the development's future. When the area had little market value, officials could tolerate deteriorating public housing. When developers saw opportunity nearby, the towers became an obstacle. The language used publicly remained focused on safety, concentrated poverty, and failed architecture. Those concerns were real. The buildings had severe physical problems. Residents had experienced violence and institutional neglect. Few people seriously argue that every high-rise should remain unchanged forever. The disagreement concerned what would happen after removal. Would residents receive improved homes in the same neighbourhood? Would every demolished public housing apartment be replaced? Would families be given a genuine choice to return? Would the new community remain affordable to people with very low incomes? Or would demolition clear the land while relocation dispersed the residents? These questions had followed public housing redevelopment in Chicago for decades. Cabrini-Green made them impossible to ignore because the contrast between its residents and the surrounding real estate market was so visible. Housing officials began promoting mixed-income development as the alternative. The concept sounded reasonable. Instead of concentrating thousands of very poor households in one complex, new neighbourhoods would include public housing residents, working families and market-rate homeowners or renters. Buildings would be lower, traditional streets would return, apartments would face sidewalks rather than isolated courtyards. Stores and services would be integrated into the neighbourhood. Mixed-income housing promised to correct many of the design and social problems associated with the old superblocks. It also reduced the number of deeply subsidised apartments. That reduction was often presented as necessary to prevent the recreation of concentrated poverty. For residents, it meant that not everyone could return. The arithmetic was simple. A tower containing hundreds of public housing apartments could be demolished. A new development might contain a smaller number of public housing units, another group of affordable apartments for working households, and a large number of market-rate homes. The total number of residences could appear impressive while the number available to the poorest former residents fell sharply. families unable to return would receive housing vouchers or transfer to other public housing. A voucher offered more apparent freedom. Instead of being assigned to a large government complex, a household could rent from a private landlord willing to participate in the programme. In theory, the family could move to a safer neighbourhood with better schools and more employment opportunities. In practice, vouchers did not erase discrimination, limited supply or poverty. A landlord could refuse to participate. An apartment might cost more than the voucher covered. A family might lack money for transportation, deposits or utility payments. A safer neighbourhood could be far from relatives, childcare and familiar services. Residents leaving Cabrini-Green were not simply moving from a bad building to a good one. They were leaving a social network built over years. Some families wanted that opportunity. They had experienced enough violence and were ready to go anywhere that seemed safer. Others wanted to remain near the near North Side where they had family, jobs, schools and churches. Many wanted both, a better apartment without losing the neighbourhood. The redevelopment process often treated those desires as incompatible. The city's public housing crisis extended far beyond Cabrini-Green. Large projects across Chicago suffered from deteriorated buildings, vacancy, crime, and weak management. The Chicago Housing Authority had become one of the most troubled housing agencies in the country. In May 1995, the federal government took control of the authority. The takeover followed years of criticism over physical conditions, financial management, and the agency's inability to provide safe housing. Federal officials gained direct influence over decisions that would determine the future of Chicago's public housing system. This was another moment when the city could no longer claim that the problems belonged only to residents or local managers. Federal intervention meant the failure had become official. The government that had helped finance the towers now acknowledged that the institution operating them could not continue as before. The takeover did not immediately improve life inside every building. Administrative control could change quickly. Elevators, plumbing, and damaged apartments could not. Residents still woke up in the same structures. They still crossed the same galleries. They still dealt with gangs whose authority had developed during years of weak management. The symbolic importance was greater than the immediate practical result. The old system had lost legitimacy. Once federal officials treated the housing authority as a failed institution, large-scale transformation became more likely. Across the country, public housing policy was changing in the same direction. In 1992, the National Commission on Severely Distressed Public Housing concluded that a portion of the nation's housing stock had reached conditions requiring major intervention. Its recommendations helped produce the Hope 6 program, which supported demolition, physical redevelopment, management reform and social services. Over time, Hope 6 shifted toward replacing traditional projects with mixed-income communities. A later federal review found that the program removed tens of thousands of public housing units nationally, and that only a minority of the homes produced were occupied by original residents. The policy reflected a broad judgment that the old high-rise model had failed. That judgment contained truth. The buildings had concentrated poor families in locations where government services were inadequate. Their design created difficult common spaces. They were expensive to repair. The housing authorities operating them often lacked the resources or competence necessary to keep them safe. Yet the declaration of failure was selective. The residents had not designed the towers. They had not chosen the sites. They had not withdrawn maintenance funding. They had not created segregated housing markets or moved industrial jobs out of the city. Still, they were the people required to move when government decided to correct its own mistakes. At Cabrini-Green, the argument for demolition grew stronger with each visible crisis. A shooting supported the case. A broken elevator supported the case. A vacant apartment used for drugs supported the case. A newspaper image of fenced galleries supported the case. The worse the conditions became, the easier it was to argue that the buildings could not be saved. This created a dangerous incentive. Maintenance might preserve public housing. Neglect made redevelopment politically possible. Residents suspected that deterioration was being allowed to continue because officials had already decided the high-rises should disappear. Whether or not every repair delay was intentional, the suspicion was understandable. Families watched nearby private development receive investment while their own buildings lost services. The contrast became sharper after the federal takeover. Cabrini-Green occupied land close to one of the fastest-growing areas of Chicago. Developers could imagine townhouses, condominiums, and commercial streets extending across the site. City officials could imagine a transformed neighborhood that no longer generated national embarrassment. Residents imagined being priced out. Housing officials promised consultation. Meetings were held, plans were presented. Tenant leaders demanded one-for-one replacement of apartments and a guaranteed right to return. The phrase right to return sounded reassuring. Its meaning depended on conditions. To qualify for a new apartment, a former resident might need to meet lease requirements, remain current on rent, avoid certain criminal convictions, pass screening, and comply with housekeeping standards. Families could spend years in temporary housing while construction proceeded. Addresses and telephone numbers changed. Some residents lost contact with the housing authority. The longer redevelopment lasted, the harder return became. A child who left in elementary school could become an adult before a replacement apartment was available. A household might settle elsewhere. An elderly resident might die before construction finished. A family could be disqualified because of a problem that developed during relocation. The promise remained attached to the original leaseholder, but time worked against the community. Cabrini-Green's population was already shrinking as buildings were emptied and closed. Vacancy produced additional danger for those who remained. A tower designed for hundreds of households became difficult to manage when only a portion of its apartments were occupied. Empty units were targets for vandalism and illegal use. Fewer residents meant fewer adults watching common areas. Stores lost customers. Schools lost enrollment. The remaining families lived inside a place being dismantled before demolition officially began. This was not an accidental side effect. Emptying buildings was part of the process required to remove them. It also made removal appear more sensible. A mostly vacant tower looked wasteful and abandoned. The public saw empty windows and asked why the structure remained standing. Fewer people remembered that it had been emptied through policy. The violence continued during this period, but the atmosphere changed. Cabrini-Green was no longer only a troubled neighborhood, it was becoming a neighborhood with an expiration date. Gang members understood that buildings might close, drug markets moved, territorial control adjusted to shrinking occupancy. Residents became uncertain about which services would continue. Repairs seemed even less likely in structures scheduled for removal. The future influenced the present. Why invest heavily in an elevator if the building might be demolished? Why renovate vacant apartments if families were being relocated? Why preserve a school if enrollment was falling? Each decision made the area less livable for the people still there. Then another crime forced Chicago to look directly into the conditions inside one of the buildings. In January 1997, a 9-year-old girl was found in a stairwell at Cabrini-Green after a brutal sexual assault. She survived but suffered permanent injuries. Her identity was protected and she became known publicly as Girl X. The attack horrified the city. Its details were so severe that they produced national attention, charitable campaigns, and public anger. The location of the assault mattered to how the story was understood. It occurred in a dark, neglected stairwell inside public housing, a space residents had complained about repeatedly. The crime was committed by an individual. The environment made it possible for him to remain unseen. The stairwell had no functioning security capable of protecting a child. The building contained the same failures that residents had described for years: inadequate lighting, weak control of common areas, and a management system unable to guarantee basic safety. Girl X became another symbol. Chicagoans donated money for her care. Public officials condemned the attack. Newspapers returned to Cabrini-Green. Residents mourned for the child and resented the implication that such cruelty represented everyone living around her. They had children in those buildings. They had spent years asking for safer stairwells. The city now spoke as though it had discovered the darkness for the first time. The assault strengthened the argument that Cabrini-Green was beyond repair. Officials could point to the crime as proof that no child should live in such an environment. Few residents disagreed with that conclusion. The disagreement remained over who would be protected by the solution. Removing a child from a dangerous building was not the same as guaranteeing her family a safe home in the same community. Demolishing a stairwell did not explain why government had allowed it to remain unsafe. The public discussion increasingly merged buildings, residents, and criminals into one problem. Cabrini-Green itself became the offender. Political speeches treated concrete and brick as though they had committed violence. The towers were described as breeding grounds, warehouses for the poor, and monuments to failed social policy. There was some relief in blaming architecture. A building could be destroyed without a trial. The deeper causes were harder to remove. Segregated schools remained. Employment inequality remained. The private housing market remained difficult for poor black families. Drug addiction and gang organizations did not disappear when residents moved. Research on Chicago's later public housing transformation found that more than 16,000 households were relocated into mixed-income developments. Voucher-supported private rentals, scattered site housing, and other public housing. The results did not support the simple belief that relocation automatically produced dramatically better lives. Households using vouchers were often among the most challenged, and residents in new mixed-income communities did not consistently show better outcomes than those who remained in traditional public housing across many measures. Those findings came later. During the 1990s, mixed-income redevelopment was presented with greater confidence. Officials said concentrated poverty had failed, and dispersal would provide opportunity. New housing would avoid the mistakes of the towers. Private investment would create safer streets. Residents would gain access to healthier communities. The plan appealed to people across the political spectrum. Conservatives saw demolition as an end to dysfunctional government housing. Liberals saw mixed-income neighbourhoods as an alternative to racial and economic isolation. Developers saw valuable land. City leaders saw an opportunity to remove a national symbol of failure. Residents saw that everyone had a vision for Cabrini-Green except the people who called it home. Tenant leaders responded by organising. They challenged demolition schedules, demanded replacement housing, and used the courts to protect residents' rights. They argued that redevelopment could not be considered successful if the original community was scattered across the city. Their position was sometimes portrayed as resistance to change. It was more accurately resistance to disappearance. Most residents did not demand that every damaged tower remain standing. They wanted the transformation to include them. They wanted safe homes, not just safer land. They wanted to remain near downtown, not be moved to another segregated neighbourhood. They wanted the city to recognise that the community contained value, even if the buildings had failed. These demands complicated the clean story officials preferred. The clean story said that Cabrini-Green had become dangerous. Government had learned from its mistakes and demolition would create a better neighbourhood. The more honest story required several additional facts. Government had concentrated black poverty there. Government had failed to maintain the property. Government had responded to social problems largely through policing. Government had allowed nearby land values to rise, while residents remained excluded from that wealth. Now government proposed to correct the failure by removing most of the people who had survived it. The city could no longer pretend that Cabrini-Green was working. Residents could no longer pretend that the buildings would be repaired and preserved. Developers could no longer pretend they had no interest in the land. The disagreement moved from whether change would happen to who would benefit from it. By the end of the 1990s, the answer was beginning to emerge. Chicago prepared a citywide program that would become known as the Plan for Transformation. It proposed demolishing most of the Housing Authority's high-rise stock, renovating selected developments, and replacing some projects with mixed-income communities. The scale was enormous. Cabrini-Green was only one part of it, but it was the most visible. The buildings that had once represented modern reform were now held up as evidence that reform had failed. Families began receiving relocation information. Towers lost more residents. Empty windows spread across the facades. At night, fewer apartments showed light. The remaining households could look across the development and see sections already becoming dark. Each dark window marked a family that had left. Some had moved by choice. Some had accepted vouchers. Some had transferred to another development. Some expected to return. Some already understood that they never would. The city had reached its decision before the final demolition schedule was complete. Cabrini-Green would not be restored as a large public housing community. The high-rises would be removed, and a different neighbourhood would take their place. What remained unresolved was the fate of the people. The buildings could be brought down one at a time. The social consequences would be scattered across hundreds of addresses, making them harder to photograph and easier to forget. That was the final advantage of demolition. A concentrated failure was visible. Displacement was not. Once the families left, the city would be able to point to new streets, new homes, and rising property values. It would be able to say that Cabrini-Green had been transformed. The former residents would carry the older neighbourhood with them, into apartments across Chicago, into suburbs, into other public housing, and into the uncertain waiting list for homes promised on the land they had been required to leave. Before the last tower fell, the community was already being separated from the place that had given it a name. The final Cabrini-Green high-rise did not fall in a single dramatic collapse. Demolition crews dismantled it slowly. Concrete walls were broken apart section by section. Steel was cut and removed. Machinery worked through floors where families had once cooked meals, argued, completed homework, and watched Chicago through apartment windows. Dust rose over land that had contained one of the most recognizable public housing developments in the United States. On March 30th, 2011, officials marked the demolition of the last surviving high-rise at 1230 North Burling Street. By then, Cabrini-Green had been disappearing for more than 15 years. The final tower mattered because it offered the city a clear ending. Television cameras could show the exposed rooms, the machinery, and the shrinking structure. Reporters could say that an era was over. Political leaders could describe the demolition as the removal of failed housing and the beginning of a safer mixed-income neighbourhood. For the people who had lived there, the ending was not nearly as clear. Cabrini-Green had never been only a collection of buildings. It was a population spread through families, schools, churches, friendships, and generations. Removing concrete did not remove those connections. It separated them. By the time the last tower came down, many former residents were living across Chicago and beyond it. Some had received housing vouchers and entered the private rental market. Others transferred to remaining public housing. Some moved into rehabilitated developments. A smaller number entered the mixed-income communities built on or near the old Cabrini-Green land. The physical project disappeared in one location. Its residents did not disappear. They carried the history into hundreds of other addresses. The official transformation had begun years earlier. In February 2000, the Chicago Housing Authority announced its plan for transformation, a 10-year effort intended to remake the city's public housing system. The plan called for demolishing most of Chicago's high-rise family developments, rehabilitating selected properties and creating mixed-income neighborhoods through partnerships with private developers. The scale was enormous. Across Chicago, tens of thousands of residents would be relocated. Towers at the Robert Taylor Homes, Stateway Gardens, Henry Horner Homes, Rockwell Gardens, and Cabrini-Green would be removed. The city promised that the dangerous isolation of traditional public housing would be replaced by communities containing public housing tenants, lower-income workers, and market-rate residents. Officials presented the plan as a necessary break with the past. The old developments had become physically deteriorated and socially isolated. Elevators failed, apartments remained vacant, and gangs controlled common spaces. Repairing every tower would have required large sums of money, and many planners believed that even complete renovation would leave the underlying concentration of poverty unchanged. Mixed-income development promised a different arrangement. The new streets would connect with the surrounding city rather than end at the edges of superblocks. Homes would be smaller in scale. Some would be townhouses. Others would be low or mid-rise apartment buildings. Entrances would face public sidewalks. Private yards, porches, and controlled indoor corridors would replace long exposed galleries. Public housing apartments would be distributed among homes rented or sold at higher prices. This arrangement was intended to reduce stigma and prevent a single development from containing only families with extremely low incomes. Supporters believed that mixed-income neighbourhoods would attract better services, stronger schools, and more private investment. Some of those changes were valuable. The new buildings were generally safer and easier to maintain than the towers. Residents did not have to depend on one elevator serving hundreds of people. Hallways were smaller. Entrances could be monitored. Streets and sidewalks created more ordinary patterns of movement. The new housing did not reproduce the enormous vertical concentration that had made Cabrini-Green difficult to manage. The question was never whether the new apartments were physically better. The question was who would be allowed to live in them. Cabrini-Green had once contained 3,607 public housing units. Its redevelopment did not replace that number with 3,607 new public housing apartments on the same land. The new communities included a mixture of public, affordable, and market-rate housing, meaning that only a portion of the homes were reserved for families with the lowest incomes. That reduction was intentional. Mixed-income policy depended on reducing concentration. Officials argued that rebuilding every public housing unit in the same location would recreate the conditions the plan was designed to eliminate. Former residents understood the argument. They also understood that reducing concentration meant reducing their presence. The policy treated their dispersal as part of the solution. Relocation began before many replacement homes were ready. Families received notices, attended meetings, and met with housing counsellors. They were offered choices that were significant but limited. A household might accept a voucher, move to another public housing development, or wait for an opportunity to enter a new mixed-income community. Each path carried requirements. Residents seeking to return to redeveloped housing had to remain in good standing with the housing authority. They could be screened for rent payments, criminal history, housekeeping, and lease compliance. Some developments imposed work requirements or expected adults to participate in employment or training programs. Supporters described these standards as necessary for building stable communities. Critics argued that they excluded the very families public housing was supposed to serve. A household could survive years in Cabrini-Green under conditions created by government neglect and then be judged unqualified for the neighbourhood built after its home was demolished. The right to return therefore existed, but it was not automatic. It depended on eligibility, available units, and the ability of families to remain connected to a long redevelopment process. Time became another screening mechanism. A family might leave Cabrini-Green expecting to return in several years. During that period, children changed schools, adults found new jobs, and relatives established routines elsewhere. Letters could be missed. Phone numbers changed. A household might accept a permanent apartment in another neighbourhood rather than remain uncertain. Some residents were formally disqualified, others simply became separated from the process. National research on the federal Hope 6 program, which supported similar redevelopment across the country, found that original residents occupied only about 1/5 of all homes created at revitalised sites. Even when researchers looked only at replacement public housing units, A little more than 1/3 were occupied by original residents. Those figures were not limited to Cabrini-Green, but they reflected the broader pattern surrounding its redevelopment. The buildings were rebuilt more reliably than the communities were restored. For families who received vouchers, the outcome depended heavily on where they could find a landlord. A housing voucher paid part of the rent in the private market. In theory, this allowed former residents to choose neighbourhoods with lower crime, better schools and more employment opportunities. Choice was restricted by reality. Some landlords refused vouchers, others accepted them only in neighbourhoods where rents remained low. Apartments in affluent areas were often too expensive or unavailable. Families faced credit checks, security deposits, and screening requirements. A mother trying to move several children also had to consider transportation, childcare, and schools. An apartment across the city might appear safer, but place her hours away from relatives who watched the children while she worked. Many voucher holders moved to other poor, predominantly black neighbourhoods. The structure of concentrated poverty became less visible because it was no longer contained in enormous towers. It did not necessarily disappear. A study of more than 16,000 households relocated through Chicago's transformation found that residents ended up in a wide range of settings, including mixed-income developments, voucher-supported private rentals, scattered-site public housing, and traditional public housing. Researchers found that voucher households had often faced greater challenges before relocation, and continued to show troubling economic and social indicators years later. They also found that residents in mixed-income developments were not consistently better off than those remaining in traditional public housing across many measures. The findings did not prove that relocation always failed. Some families entered safer neighbourhoods and better apartments. Some children gained distance from active gang territories. Some adults found stability that had been impossible inside deteriorated towers. The findings did show that changing an address did not automatically change income, health, employment, or family circumstances. Housing was central to the problem. It was not the entire problem. The Chicago Housing Authority could move a family away from a dangerous building. It could not guarantee a good school, stable employment, reliable childcare, or freedom from discrimination in the new neighbourhood. Some former Cabrini-Green residents reported relief after leaving. They no longer heard gunfire regularly. Their children could play outside with less supervision. Buildings were cleaner. Repairs were completed more quickly. Others experienced isolation. At Cabrini-Green, a neighbour might watch a child, share food, or provide transportation. After relocation, the same family could find itself surrounded by strangers. A person who had known every household on a gallery might now know no one in the building. This loss was difficult to measure. Government studies could count employment, income, and arrests. They could compare crime rates and school outcomes. They could not easily calculate the value of a grandmother living 2 floors away. They could not assign a number to the neighbour who recognised that a child was in trouble. They could not measure the security produced by knowing which door would open during an emergency. The old community had contained violence and hardship. It had also contained forms of support that relocation scattered. As the towers disappeared, redevelopment moved across the Cabrini-Green site in separate phases. New communities included North Town Village, Parkside of Old Town Square, and other developments combining different income levels and housing types. Streets that had been removed during the superblock era were restored. Townhouses and apartment buildings appeared where the towers had stood. The visual change was dramatic. The old buildings had been uniform, large, and unmistakably public. Their replacements looked more like private urban development. Brick facades, porches, landscaping, and individual entrances reduced the separation between the former project land and the neighbourhoods around it. A person unfamiliar with the history could pass through parts of the area without realising that Cabrini-Green had once stood there. This was considered a success. The stigma attached to the architecture had disappeared. Property values rose. New homeowners and market-rate tenants moved in. Stores and services followed investment. The near North Side became one of the clearest examples of Chicago's economic transformation, from an industrial city into a centre of services, finance, tourism, and high-value real estate. By the mid-1990s, expensive land had already surrounded Cabrini-Green while its residents remained poor and determined to stay. After demolition, the separation became less visible because fewer poor families remained concentrated on the site. The new neighbourhood contained subsidised residents, but they were a minority within a larger development. Mixed-income planners believed this was a strength. No group would dominate. Public housing residents would use the same streets and facilities as market-rate households. Daily life revealed that income differences did not disappear, simply because families lived nearby. Residents could occupy similar-looking homes while following different lease conditions. Market-rate owners might build equity as property values increased. Public housing tenants paid subsidised rent but did not gain ownership. Rules could also be enforced differently. Public housing residents were subject to housing authority requirements. Their eligibility could depend on continued lease compliance. Market-rate homeowners possessed more control over their property and greater protection from removal. The development appeared integrated. Its residents did not hold equal economic power. Social interaction was often limited. Families might greet one another without forming close relationships. Children used the same spaces, but adults differed in work schedules, institutions, and expectations for the neighbourhood. Some market-rate residents worried that public housing tenants would bring the problems of Cabrini-Green into the new development. Some former Cabrini residents believed wealthier newcomers treated them as unwanted reminders of the land's past. A mixed-income neighbourhood could place inequality at close range without resolving it. That did not make the model meaningless. Living near households with different incomes was still less segregated than the old arrangement. The new design removed many of the physical conditions gangs had exploited. Residents gained access to safer buildings and a neighbourhood receiving substantial investment. The result remained incomplete. The public promise had been to transform Cabrini-Green. The transformation benefited the land more consistently than the original population. Legal action played an important role in preserving even the limited right of return that residents received. Tenant leaders and attorneys challenged redevelopment plans and demanded that public housing families not be removed without enforceable protections. The Cabrini-Green Local Advisory Council represented residents in negotiations over relocation, replacement housing, and development. Without this organising, the number of returning residents might have been even smaller. The struggle continued long after demolition began. In 2024, the Chicago Housing Authority announced financing for the fifth and final phase of Parkside of Old Town. The planned 99-unit project included 37 public housing replacement apartments, 28 other affordable units, and 34 market-rate homes. The authority stated that the public housing units would serve former Cabrini-Green residents who retained a right to return. That announcement came 13 years after the last high-rise was demolished. It came more than 2 decades after the plan for transformation began. The timing reveals how long redevelopment lasts for people waiting on the other side of it. A child who left Cabrini-Green in 2000 could be raising children by the time the final promised phase received financing. An adult resident could become elderly. Some original tenants would no longer be alive to use the right they had fought to preserve. The city's physical transformation operated on the schedule of financing, land acquisition, planning approvals, and private development. Human life continued at normal speed. Former residents did not remain suspended while the new neighbourhood was built. They formed attachments elsewhere, lost relatives, changed jobs, and aged. The meaning of return changed with every passing year. For some, returning to the area remained a matter of justice. The family had been required to leave and had a right to benefit from the improved neighbourhood. For others, the replacement community no longer felt like home. The buildings were different. The neighbours were different. The stores, streets, and expectations had changed. Cabrini-Green had been removed so thoroughly that returning to the location did not necessarily mean returning to the place residents remembered. Memory became one of the few remaining forms of ownership. Former residents organised reunions and maintained connections. They shared photographs, stories and accounts of growing up in the development. Their memories challenged the public image of Cabrini-Green as nothing more than a site of violence. They remembered the gangs and shootings. They also remembered music, friendships, school programs, tenant leaders, and adults who watched over children. They remembered apartments that had been condemned by outsiders, but carefully maintained inside. They remembered the names of people who had died and the names of people who had helped others survive. These recollections did not romanticize the towers. They restored complexity. The National Public Housing Museum emerged from a similar effort to preserve histories that demolition might otherwise erase. The museum developed plans to occupy the last surviving building from the original Jane Addams Homes, another Chicago public housing development, and to document the experiences of public housing residents across the country. Its work reflects a growing understanding that public housing history cannot be told only through architecture, policy and crime. The residents were not background figures inside a government experiment. They were the people whose lives gave the places meaning. Cabrini-Green also remained present in popular culture. Movies, television programs, music and urban legends continued using the name after the towers disappeared. The development's reputation proved more durable than its buildings. This created another separation between memory and image. Former residents remembered a specific community. Popular culture remembered a symbol of danger. The symbol could be reused without including the government decisions that built Cabrini-Green, segregated its residents, neglected its structures and later cleared the land. The name survived because it carried fear. The policy history was less dramatic. After the last tower fell, officials often described Cabrini-Green as a lesson. The lesson depended on who was speaking. Architects saw evidence that large high-rise projects and isolated superblocks were dangerous models for family housing. Housing officials saw the failure of concentrating extremely poor households without adequate operating support. Police saw the difficulty of enforcing law in buildings gangs could control. Developers saw the possibility of converting distressed public land into mixed-income neighbourhoods. Residents saw what happened when government created a community, abandoned its obligations and later treated removal as rescue. All of these lessons contain truth. None is sufficient alone. The buildings did contribute to the crisis. Their galleries, elevators and stairwells became difficult to control. Their scale placed too many families under one management system. The design did not cause segregation. Concrete did not close factories. Elevators did not reduce maintenance budgets. Stairwells did not create racial discrimination in the private housing market. The towers became containers for problems produced far beyond their walls. Demolition removed the containers. It did not automatically resolve what had been placed inside them. Chicago remains divided by race and income. Affordable housing remains difficult to find in neighborhoods with strong schools, transportation, and employment. Vouchers continue to depend on landlord participation and available units. Public housing waiting lists remain long. Cabrini-Green's disappearance did not end the need that had produced it. Families still require safe homes at rents they can afford. The city solved the visible problem of the towers more successfully than the underlying problem of housing inequality. The land tells a different story now. New homes stand where the high-rises once dominated the skyline. Streets cross areas formerly occupied by superblocks. Children play near buildings with controlled entrances and maintained landscaping. Market-rate residents live beside public housing tenants, in a neighbourhood connected to some of Chicago's wealthiest districts. This is not the Cabrini-Green shown in old news footage. It is cleaner, lower and less visibly separated from the city. It is also a neighbourhood many former residents could never afford without a subsidised unit. The land gained value while they were living there. Most did not share directly in that gain. A family that had purchased a home in the surrounding near North Side decades earlier might possess a valuable asset today. A family that paid rent at Cabrini-Green contributed to the community for years but left without ownership. This difference explains why redevelopment cannot be understood only as improvement. The neighbourhood improved. The outcome for former residents varied. Some benefited. Some lost more than they gained. Many experienced both. A person could be grateful for a safer apartment and still mourn the community left behind. A parent could believe demolition was necessary and still resent being excluded from the new development. A former resident could condemn the violence and defend the people. These positions do not contradict one another. They describe what it means to live through a policy that improves a place by removing much of its population. There is no final night when Cabrini-Green ends completely. The last tower fell, but former residents continued telling stories. Replacement housing continued being planned. Families continued waiting for return opportunities. The name continued appearing in public debate whenever Americans discuss public housing, segregation, or urban violence. Cabrini-Green remains useful as a warning, but warnings can be simplified until they become excuses. It's easy to say that public housing failed. It is harder to ask which parts were allowed to fail. It is easy to blame concentrated poverty. It is harder to explain why poor black families were concentrated in particular locations. It is easy to show a broken building. It is harder to show the decades of political decisions behind the broken window. The history does not ask us to pretend Cabrini-Green was safe or successful. It asks us to remember that failure was produced. The development began with new apartments offered as an answer to overcrowding and unsafe housing. It became segregated through policies that restricted where black families could live. Its buildings deteriorated under inadequate maintenance. Gangs entered the spaces legitimate institutions abandoned. Crack made territorial control highly profitable. Police answered the resulting violence with tactics that often treated home as a battlefield. The city eventually demolished the towers and rebuilt the land. That sequence took almost 70 years. The people living there experienced it one morning, one repair request, one shooting, one relocation notice, and one demolished building at a time. After the last tower fell, the Chicago skyline no longer contained the structure that had carried Cabrini-Green's reputation. Nothing remained tall enough to dominate the view. That may be why the final stage felt peaceful from a distance. The machinery stopped. The dust settled. New construction began. Yet somewhere in Chicago, a former resident could still describe exactly where an apartment had been. She could point toward a new street and remember a gallery several floors above it. She could identify the place where children waited for the school bell, where a neighbour held a party, or where everyone gathered after someone died. The coordinates remained even after the building did not. That is what cities often forget during redevelopment. A cleared site looks empty only to people who did not live there. For everyone else, it remains crowded with rooms, routes, voices and decisions that changed thousands of lives. Cabrini-Green is gone. The conditions that created it are not. And the new neighbourhood standing in its place does not close the story. It leaves Chicago with the same question that began the entire experiment decades earlier. Whether a city can provide safe, affordable homes without isolating the people who need them, neglecting the buildings around them, or deciding later that the land is worth more without them.